Chapter 8. When Kiera was 14 years old, the boys of the village had dragged her and a few others into the forest to see a catfish they'd discovered, lying amongst the trees. Some creature had apparently dragged it from the river, began to feast, then lost interest halfway through and wandered away, leaving what remained of the mangled carcass lying in the grass. An eye was gone, and several pieces were missing. The only thing that remained entirely intact was the gaping mouth, whiskered and bloody, tiny broken teeth poking through the mottled skin. The image alone had been enough to turn her stomach. Then she'd been struck by the smell. And perhaps the most grotesque moment of all, she realized that it reminded her of syrup. Those viscous strands of things meant to stay internal, oozing slowly across the forest floor. It was hands down the most revolting thing she'd ever seen. Even years later, the memory still made her grimace. It was absolutely nothing compared to this creature. While it might have been vaguely shaped like a man, it was sized like a giant, but a giant who was somehow in decay. A thick stench rose from its marbled grey skin, and even from a distance, it looked like it would be slick to the touch. Its back was hunched, its eyes were yellowed, and there were two spiraled holes where its ears should have been. Like it used to have horns, but they'd been pushed inside the creature's skull. It didn't actually have many teeth, and the ones it did were so large and misshapen, Kiera didn't know how it would ever be able to close its mouth. Then she saw the long, scythe-like claws on the edges of both hands, and realized a terrible truth. It probably just swallows its food whole. She and Jessie froze where they were kneeling, gazing across the meadow with the expression of two children who realized one of their nightmares had suddenly come to life. Even the Fae had been struck silent, staring at the creature with the same open-mouthed disbelief at the rest. At one point, he lifted a slow hand to the back of his head, like there was a chance he might have struck it on the rocks, like there was a chance he was merely dreaming. Then the monster let out an ear-splitting howl, and those illusions were laid forever to rest. "Is it an ogre?" Jessie asked in a whisper. It was easy to forgive his mistake. The creature stood over 50 feet tall, its mottled head grazing the very tops of the trees. With every lurching step, the earth beneath it trembled, and the longer it stood there without moving, the more the ground began to sink under its massive feet. "This is what caused the landslide. This is what broke away the edge of the mountain." "It isn't an ogre," Eden breathed, never taking his eyes from the beast. "We called it a blisserin. I haven't seen one in so many years. My people believed them to be extinct." The blisserin seemed to take offense. It threw back its head with another vicious howl, revealing a tangle of huge knotted veins that stretched like tree roots from its neck. Most of them were connected to its body, but others appeared to hang free, leaking dark, brackish droplets whenever the creature swung its head. Jessie shuddered in spite of himself, taking a step back. "How did we not—" "The mountain was crumbling," Eden answered quietly, guessing his question. "I could not hear over it, and in spite of their size, they can be perfectly silent. It's why they were so hard to track when my people drove them from this place, many hundreds of years ago." Kiera merely stared at the creature, her entire body trapped in a silent scream. "And now they're back?" The Fae froze a split second, as if he couldn't believe the answer himself. Then he let out a slow breath, preparing himself for what was about to come. "So it would seem." The creature took one step forward, and then another. There was still a precarious path running alongside the mountain, a slim edge that had not yet been eroded away. But even now, that ground had already started quaking, and while every instinct was screaming at them to run, the friends were suddenly sure they would not be able to get away. "So then what? We fight it?" She felt the knife in her pocket, remembering the Fae's instructions the day he'd pressed it into her hands. Little flicks, he'd told her. Just use little flicks. She lifted her gaze to the glycerin. I don't think that's going to cut it. The Fae considered his options for only a moment before the shock and fear subsided and centuries of experience took their place. In the olden times, it would have taken scores of his people to subdue such a creature. Companies of immortal archers, with armored warriors by their side. He had a teenage shifter and a barmaid. But he'd learned never to play the odds. Jesse, you need to shift. Jesse nodded quickly and eased out of his boots. Only a second later, the man was gone, and a jittery-looking wolf had sprung up in his place. Without thinking about it, Kiera's eyes drifted from the curve of Jesse's claws, up to the jagged, bone-like hooks protruding from the glycerin's hands. Not exactly a comparison. What about me? She whispered. Should I take the... Wait until the fighting begins, then slip into the forest. Do not leave until it's properly distracted, Eden added sharply. I don't want it turning on you the second you reach the trees. A jolt of surprise broke through her paralysis. I can't just leave the two of you. I can help. This will help. Eden cut her off again, slowly reaching up and taking the slender bow from his back. I won't be worried about you. I can give all my attention to the beast. So can Jesse. Though he was unable to say anything, the wolf seemed to agree. He caught her gaze and nodded sharply, staring with those same vibrant green eyes she'd come to know so achingly well. But weigh the odds and use your head, Eden said softly, glancing down at her for the first time. You cannot yet fight such a creature, and there is no time to argue. She stared back at him, wondering what he'd do if she simply grabbed a blade from his satchel and charged at the creature with the rest of them. But there was no hint of compromise in his expression, no ounce of leeway that would let her think he'd spoken anything but the truth. He's right. I can't fight it. I'd only get in the way. With a trembling nod, she took a step back, watching as the others simultaneously eased forward. It was strange the way they moved, almost as if they'd rehearsed it. At no point did they look at each other, but at no point were they not absolutely certain where the other happened to be. The glycerin continued stalking forward, shaking the ground with every step. She lifted her arms for balance, stumbling even in retreat. Then she grabbed the Fae's sleeve. Wait, she gasped. How will I know when it's properly distracted? He reached up slowly and drew an arrow from the quiver on his back, fitting it to the bow without ever taking his eyes away from the beast. His arms rose with immortal assurance, aiming high and true, while fingers fit lightly around the feathers, pulling them towards his chin. You'll know. For a split second, nothing happened. Then he released the arrow, and it buried itself in the creature's eye. I'd say it's distracted. There was a sound unlike any other, bowing the very branches of the trees. The creature threw back its head, swatting uselessly with a pair of blunted hands, but the damage was already done, and giant drops of acrid blood fell like rain on the ground. The pine needles sizzled wherever they touched as it seeped into the deep earth like a burn. For a split second, all Kiera could do was stare, knowing instinctively that nothing planted there would ever be able to grow. Then the beast charged, and she took off running towards the forest. There was no sense of grace to it, and it certainly wasn't at a speed either the Fae or the shifter would have liked. But for this, she couldn't be blamed. The ground was jumping beneath her feet, and it was impossible to maintain any sense of balance. Instead of running, she tripped and fell and lurched and stumbled, anything she could get beneath the cover of the trees. Not until she was safely hidden in their branches did she dare to look back, holding onto the trunk of a redwood for balance as the two sides came together in the center of the field. It was laughable, the difference between them, the world's most terrible joke. With all the bravery they could muster, the Fae and the shifter threw themselves into battle, but it was a battle with only one side. They could not get close enough to do any true damage, and within a matter of seconds, the Fae's arrows were all but spent. He saved only 2, for what, she would never know. Perhaps it was custom among his people to never let the quiver go empty, but she didn't remember him doing such a thing when they fought the wolves. The wolves, she thought, remembering their flashing jaws and spectral howls. What I wouldn't give to exchange this newest abhorrence for that pack of murderous wolves. There was a shout and a high-pitched whine. The fight was getting dirtier. The shifter and the Fae had coordinated their efforts, trying to lure the Blisteran's head low enough to the ground that the Fae could attack it with daggers. But even then, she didn't see what chance they had. It would take a blade 10 times the length of one Eden was carrying to strike anything of vital importance. And even if he did, the Fae would be burned immediately by the blood. Nevertheless, they continued to try. Jesse kept low to the ground, circling behind the beast and making as much noise as he possibly could. Like trolls and giants, the Blisteran didn't possess much higher thought, and he was trying to disorientate it, giving Eden the time he needed to attack. The problem was that the beast didn't move like trolls or giants. There was nothing looming or lumbering in the way it swung around its limbs. It moved in quick, jerking motions, ones that did more to disorientate her friends than anything they were managing to give in return. Even worse than that was the creature's corrosive blood. No sooner did they manage to strike a blow than they were punished for it. "Get down!" Eden's voice echoed in the air as Jesse broke his circular pattern and darted straight up the side of the Blisteran's leg. It was an astonishingly bold attack, one most shifters wouldn't have made in their wildest of dreams. But the moment he reached its kneecap, he was in trouble. With a deafening cry, the monster whirled around, off-balancing the wolf, then made a grab for him with those bony claws. The tip of one grazed Jesse's shoulder, and his grip on the beast faltered. Before he could correct it, the Blisteran reached for him with its other hand. "No!" Kiera watched in horror as it managed to grab hold, prying him loose the way a careless child might treat a toy. The claws tightened abruptly, and the wolf made a strange coughing sound, the legs scrambling against the creature's hands, suddenly still. There was an odd twisting of its mouth, something that might have been a smile. Then it lifted the broken wolf higher, ready to swallow it whole. Only to receive the last of the Fae's arrows. Eden didn't shoot them from the ground. They were small enough in comparison, and he couldn't risk them not doing the appropriate damage. Instead, he sprinted up the creature's body just like a shifter, perching upon the same clawed hand as he fired straight into the same eye as before. They buried inside, one on top of the other, pushing so deep and with such a nauseating sound, Kiera was certain that on at least one side, the creature had gone blind. It seemed to agree. The accompanying screech flattened Kiera where she stood, as it flung its tiny assailants to the ground, thrashing with mad bursts of shrieks and clawing at the side of its own face. Jesse landed with a soft cry, picking himself up quickly and limping away from the creature's stampeding feet. The Fae landed just a moment beside him, but no sooner had he leapt to his feet than he was struck in the chest with a splash of that foul, sizzling blood. There was a genuine scream as Eden doubled over, clawing wildly at his tunic. The wolf swept him from behind and dragged him to a drier patch of land. But the second they were clear of the Blisteran's reach, it was clear to see the Fae was in bad shape. While most of his body had escaped relatively unscathed, a spray of the creature's blood had splashed onto his collarbone, scorching straight through his clothing and burrowing into the fair skin underneath. "Get it off!" he gasped, tearing desperately at his shirts. "Get it!" The wolf bit down on the fabric and tore it free, watching with wide-eyed horror as the Fae's skin burned and bubbled, dissolving into nothing before his very eyes. There was another agonizing cry, and Eden dropped to one knee. The tips of his fingers were raw where they touched it, and the pain only seemed to increase when his skin tore open and the toxin mixed with his own blood. He tried to speak, but couldn't. One hand clenched painfully against his shoulder, like he was holding himself together, as the shadow of the glycerin came over them both. In only a second, it would be over. They both knew it, just as well as the girl watching in the trees. The world seemed to suspend as they watched it approach. There was time only for decisions. Jesse stared a split second longer, then turned abruptly, scanning the forest until he found Kiera's shining eyes. They held for what seemed like a small eternity before all that promise was wrenched away, and he looked pointedly towards the valley. The silent message was clear. Run. He could do nothing to help her, and he wouldn't leave the Fae to die alone. If he tried to carry him, the beast would easily catch them both, but there was a chance she could still make it. And what would be left? The question came upon her swiftly, splintering into smaller images as she considered what her life might be like if she did as he asked. She would walk again in the sunlight, but would it ever feel warm? She would close her eyes to sleep, but would she ever get rest? Would she ever truly leave this place and forget the sight of them, huddled together in the grass, waiting for the death that was sure to claim them, still urging her to save herself and run? No, she didn't think she would. The meadow was littered with fallen blades and patches of blood. It was a battlefield, cloaked in ironic flowers, but no one had remembered their packs. She was close to them, close enough that, instead of running down the mountain, she darted to Jesse's satchel and reached deep inside. Her fingers closed around something hard, and she straightened quickly, turning not towards the valley like the shifter asked, but striding out to join them on the sunlit lawn. The wolf growled in protest, and the Fae lifted his bloodshot eyes to hers, but her attention was only for the monster. She lifted her arm and threw as hard as she could manage, striking it in the head not with a blade or an arrow, but with the only thing she found with any weight, one of her treasured books. "You are uglier than a catfish!" In hindsight, she always regretted screaming that particular phrase. It was not the kind to stand on, not the final thing to be shouted as you sentenced yourself to die. But, like everything else that had happened since that fateful night in the village, it was very much beyond her control. The glycerin lifted its head and stared with one eye in her direction. Crouched before it was easier prey, but her hair flamed bright against the muted colours of the forest. It was a curiosity. It was something to be chased. And so she did what everything chased by monsters did quite naturally. She turned on her heel and started to run. Soup. Perhaps it was simply the most mundane subject in her brain could muster, or perhaps it was the natural symmetry that seems to frame things when a person's about to die. But that's what Kiera was pondering as she tore through the forest, a denizen of the lightless underworld on her heels. She thought about soup, and she hated herself. How many times had she stood in that smoky kitchen to prepare the nightly meal, swinging her trusty cleaver and decapitating the catch of the day? How many times had she gleefully imagined herself a famed warrior instead of a lowly barmaid, felling ogres and demons with every stroke? It had seemed so glamorous, a shimmering alternative to an otherwise ordinary life. There wasn't a child in her village who hadn't done the same. Heroes and monsters fought all the time in those woods, screaming back and forth in tiny voices, punctuated with the clattering of sticks. In all that time, it had become so habituated, such an established aspiration, that she truly never stopped to consider the other side of things. That such a life wasn't purely fiction, that people had fought against such terrors since the dawn of time. Most of them wished they hadn't. Most of them had died. And yet, she'd dreamed of such a life as long as the night would allow it. Stupid fricking dream. There wasn't room for much higher thought as she tore like a banshee through the forest, hearing the crashing of branches and the rattling of trees as the glycerin thundered behind. There wasn't room for much higher thought as she tore like a banshee through the forest, hearing the crashing of branches and the rattling of trees as the Bestseller thundered behind. There wasn't room for much anything else besides a blinding, accelerating panic, like a deer racing on spindly legs from a fire. She imagined all one might see were the whites of her eyes. And yet, there was room enough for a splinter of self-loathing. There was room enough for her to hate the girl who dreamed of such things, to hate her with the passion of a nova. At least she'll pay for it. The ground lurched, and she let out an involuntary shriek, careening forward before righting herself with an unlikely scampering of feet. Never had she run so fast in her life, and never could it have mattered less. The creature was closing in fast. The only reason it hadn't caught her yet was because it was having an increasingly difficult time managing the forest with the use of a single eye. The forest paid the price for Eden's arrows. The Bestseller would take a step, stumble, then smash its hand into a nearby redwood or a nearby boulder, or even into the mountain itself. No matter what it struck, the thing crumbled as though it was made of glass. The sharp tang of sap and freshly hewn rock trailed behind them as they made their way down the rocky slope, hanging like a solemn warning on the breeze. Stay in your burrows, stay in your dens. This way brings death. She didn't know whether it was mere irony or simply predictable. She'd escaped the wrath of a 3-headed dragon, only to be killed by its ghoulish little cousin. She'd finally taken those first tiny steps towards being able to defend herself, only to have it ripped from her. What do you want to happen? A choked breath tore from her lips, and she almost tumbled as she ran. Like something out of a dream, the Fae's voice echoed in her mind, calm and coaxing, as if he was running beside her. What? Keep your head clear. Remember what you want. She actually glanced to the side, searching for him. Perhaps she had gone mad. Perhaps the terror had fractured something in her brain, and her final moments would be spent in confusion, lost in echoes of voices that were no longer there. Or perhaps she should listen to the voices. What do you want, Kiera? The answer came to her, so simple and so strong, she gasped the words out loud. I want to live. It named the problem and broadened her focus to something other than the mere retreat. In order to live, the Bestseller needed to die, and she couldn't do something like that by herself. I needed something bigger than myself, she thought, arms pumping as she sprinted over a carpet of leaves. Though what is bigger than a giant? I don't... The answer came to her like a gong, resonating from head to foot. A giant-sized fall. Without stopping to think, she turned abruptly and veered towards that loose ground she'd been avoiding, the thin crest of earth that dropped suddenly into a cliff. She didn't see the wolf racing up behind her, nor did she see the way the creature corrected its course and followed suit, barreling towards that flicker of crimson without bothering to see where it might lead. There was a good chance it wouldn't work. She was aware of this. There was a good chance the ground would give way and they both would fall. But a single look at the monster and the choice became simple. She would rather fall to her death than be feasted upon in those bony hands. I should have said something better. It was the first of many times she'd think such a thing, seeing the edge of the bluff grow closer and closer as the sun broke suddenly through the thinning trees. I should have shouted goodbye, or thanked them for coming with me. The creature broke from the trees behind her, and she threw her body to the side. I should have kissed Jessie 1,000 more times than I did. What happened next happened quickly, and very little of it was of her choosing. The ground did indeed give way, and both she and the Bestseller started to fall. For the second time in a very short while, she found herself suddenly weightless and screaming as the picture swirled into a blur of colours and flashing light. And for the second time in a very short while, A hand reached out and grabbed hers, heaving her back towards the mounting, snapping her other wrist in two. Chapter 9. There were no grand theatrics when Jessie dragged Kiera back over the crumbling bluff and onto the mountain. No spinning arcs or muted profanities or promises of death. Considering the series of events that had led them to such a place, the eventual conclusion was rather subdued. He pulled her over the edge. She stumbled. Then they embraced. "I cannot believe you did that," he breathed, holding her like she was a part of himself, their bodies pressed to the point of pain. I kept waiting for it not to be real." She let out a shuddering breath, wilting like a flower against him. "It wasn't nearly so daring as it seemed," she admitted. "I tripped a lot." He pulled back just far enough to see her face, staring down with open wonder. He'd expected tears or shock or belated screaming, perhaps a punch for the wrist. But she was calm, unnervingly calm, same as when she held the book. "I don't know what to say to that," he confessed softly, dropping his eyes. "In all my life, I've never seen a girl so brave. And reckless. You've been spending too much time with the Fae." His voice cut short as both of them looked up with sudden feeling. He decided to stay when all hope seemed lost, to stay and let the beast kill both of them, in the hopes that she might have more time to get away. When she'd taken off running, he didn't stop to think before tearing after her. He didn't give his immortal savior a single word of goodbye. "Is he still alive?" She could scarcely bring herself to say the words, and the shifter went pale the second he heard them, turning his gaze without thinking to stare back up the slope. "He was when I left," he said quietly, trying not to picture the scene. "He was just kneeling there, shaking so hard. Kiera, it's my fault. He never would have gotten hurt if I hadn't..." They shared a look, then pushed to their feet. A second later, they were running once more. It was a far different thing to force one's body uphill, especially when the path was littered and splintered, with trees and sudden gulfs, and creeping pockets of acidic blood that hissed against their boots the second it made contact. That hissed against her boots. Jessie had shimmered back into a man only so he'd have hands to grab her, but his clothes were still somewhere at the top of the peak. It spoke a lot to their state of mind that this didn't make more of an impact. Neither did the grueling climb. In less time than Kiera would have thought possible, considering they were riding on nothing but adrenaline and prayers, they reached the same clearing as before. Only to find a crumpled figure in the middle of the grass. "No!" They stepped forward at the same time, then froze without getting any closer. All that could be seen amongst the trampled blades of grass was the tip of a boot and a wisp of sunlit hair. The Fae himself was a mere outline, an outline so terribly still she feared he may have been dead already. But he lifted his head as the two approached, brightening with the most unlikely of smiles. "I heard it fall." It was the only thing he said. Then the pain overtook him, and the others rushed forth. "It's all right," Jessie panted, catching him lightly as he coiled towards the grass. "It's going to be all right. Let's just ease you down. That's it, nice and slow. All your weight on me, okay?" It was a mark of how depleted the Fae must have felt that he surrendered to the shifter's hands without a hint of protest, allowing himself to be lowered to the ground as the others closed in on both sides. With exceedingly gentle hands, Jessie brushed back Eden's long hair so that he could see the wound for himself. At that point, he froze, every hint of expression stilling on his face. "How bad is it?" Eden asked through gritted teeth, doing everything in his power not to black out from the pain. "Tell me, is it terrible?" "It is impossible to lie to a Fae." Kiera and Jessie shared a quick look, remembering the words at the same time. It's... The shifter trailed off, then seemed to find a compromise, shaking his head with a thoughtful expression, whilst biting his lip. You know, it's what you'd expect. Eden's eyes flashed to Kiera. She stared deliberately at the grass. By the gods, the Fae muttered, taking great care not to look at himself. What have I done to deserve such companions? You should see your faces, like someone spat in your ale. A brave attempt at humour, but things were tenuous at best. Despite the Fae's natural ability to recover from such injuries, there were some hurts from which there could be no return. If death had not come immediately, and his friends could not possibly understand how it hadn't, then it would surely not be far behind. Even now it looked as though parts of him were fading. Little chips had appeared in all that immortal light. Eden, I don't have the skill to heal such a thing, Jessie confessed softly, kneeling beside him in the grass. How you're still awake is beyond me. I can see to the bone. The Fae pulled in a shaky breath, wishing he hadn't asked. To the bone, huh? He lay there a moment longer, trying to break above the unending waves of pain. Then, with the greatest effort, he turned his gaze over the side of the mountain. In that case, we need to find some water, and we're not going to do that on this ridge. A man born of miracles, he performed another, pushing Jessie's hands away and rising to his feet. Half a miracle. He made it only to his knees, then stopped abruptly, closing his eyes as the others stared in palsied shock. After a few excruciating seconds, he reached silently for the wolf. Jessie was there in a moment, as confused as he was afraid. What are you doing? He gasped. Eden, you need to rest. I need to heal, the Fae interrupted shortly. Such a wound is beyond your skill. It is also beyond mine. There are other ways to travel north. This was simply the fastest. He squinted at the sun, then started shuffling weakly down the peak. Screw the mountain. We'll head to the lowlands. The others stared after him, gaping as though he'd gone mad. Then, when it became clear that he was leaving the meadow with or without them, they hurried to follow along. The lowlands? Kiera repeated in confusion, racing to grab their packs, then reeling back as a jolt of pain shot up her wrists. Most days she would have complained bitterly of such a thing. This didn't feel like the best time. But we've never discussed that route. Is it anywhere close? Eden's head jerked up and down as he continued walking. There was something pained yet frighteningly determined about his stride. Like, if he stopped, that final step might be his last. Of course it's close. Everywhere is close. The shifter threw her a worried look, halfway in the process of buckling his pants. It was hard to know if the Fae was making sense, or if the details had been lost to some charming insanity. It didn't help that they'd been asking themselves that same question since the day they'd left. I don't understand, Jessie inserted tentatively, circling a supportive arm around the Fae as the trio began limping down the hill. You want to heal, so we need to find water? Like, to hydrate? If you want to leave the mountain, I fully agree, but there isn't any water, he added gently, wishing the Fae would simply black out so he could carry him the rest of the way. You saw how it was on the climb up here. Not a drop of water, not even a woodland spring. There will be water now, Eden interrupted, setting his jaw against the pane. The glycerin. That's why the forest was so dry. The creature is straight pestilence, and those spirits entrusted with the rivers and streams didn't want it contaminating their water. It will be back now. I promise. Definitely the insanity. Kiera was about to say as much when the Fae came to a sudden stop, registering her presence for the first time. His body might have been shaking, but his eyes were remarkably steady as they burned into hers. His voice was steady too. And angry. Definitely angry. Remind me, what is the first thing I told you to do in a fight? Her cheeks flamed with a blush. I swear it's on the tip of my— I told you to run! Yes, that's it. Damaged as he was, the Fae still managed to give off the air of a disapproving general, glaring down at her as he pointed back towards the forest. A monster walked out of those trees. Did you run? Jessie's eyes twinkled with the hint of a smile. I don't remember her running. Traitor. I actually ran quite a bit, she corrected. Eden was unamused. A monster walked out of those trees, and you threw a book at it. I suppose there's a metaphor in there somewhere. She considered her options for a moment, then decided he would most likely forget most of the exchange due to blood loss, and flashed him a winning smile. Yes, but you see, the idea of my running was always conditional, she bargained. You told me to run, except on those rare occasions I littered the earth with pieces of my enemies. He stared for a lengthy moment, then turned back to the trail. We will discuss this further when my vision clears and I only see one of you. She bit down on her lip, fighting back a grin. Ah, but two might give me a fighting chance. The Fae might have been countless centuries older than his companions, but some part of him had frozen at a similar age. It was the part that chafed against healers and glared at the sun when he didn't want to get up early. The part that adored a new bow and laughed at silly jokes with the rest of them when the day's travel was finished. It was a part with which his new friends were becoming intimately familiar as they made their way at a crawling pace to the valley floor. This cloak is strangling me, he muttered, pulling irritably at the chain. A fresh wave of blood seeped from his collar, but he was more concerned with the gleaming clasp. Untie it for me, will you? I cannot do it from this angle. Jessie, pull it free. The shifter reached at once, then caught himself. I'm sorry, I can't. It's silver. Eden glanced down in surprise, while Kiera hurried to do it herself. It fell with a whisper from his shoulders, cascading to the ground in rolls of muted emerald. She stuffed it into her pack. I didn't know it was silver. The others looked at him, then continued silently down the trail. How unspeakably different their lives had been, all three appearing relatively the same, though there were leagues of disparity between them. The Fae moved throughout the realm as if drifting with the clouds, his bright eyes seeing endless possibility as the world opened itself to him, another turn in an endless game. The others scraped through the seasons, rising and falling on the whims of forces larger than themselves, forced to bend and adjust and settle for each one. Of course, they knew there was a different side to every story. While they weren't certain exactly how many decades or centuries their friend had been alive, a great many of those had been fraught with peril. He spoke of things with confidence, because he had already experienced them from over the span of countless lives. This was not the first time he'd faced a Blissrin. This was not the first time he'd trudged down a blood-soaked mountain, forcing one foot in front of another, dragging both himself and others from the brink of certain death. The dream of civilization had not sprung up overnight. It was an idea that had gradually blossomed through a cycle of perpetual hardships, like a springtime flower reaching through the weeds. The perceived arrogance and aloofness was not a first choice or even a second. It was a lesson that had been driven into the bones of every immortal, creating a barrier of distance from their mortal companions, shielding themselves from the inevitable, lest all they do is weep. But a history's worth of perspective was never small enough for a single sitting, and, as they picked their way down the mountains, Jessie and Kiera were struck by a solitary thing. At no point in their entire lives would they ever have been unaware they were wearing something as fine as silver. The sun is beginning to drift, Jessie murmured, graciously moving them past it. His eyes briefly scanned the woods before turning to the Fae. Which way should we go? Eden shivered petulantly against the cold, already missing his cloak. Must I have an opinion on everything? Kiera fought back a grin as the shifter prayed for patience. No, he muttered, tightening his supportive grip. But you do. The silence that followed was the type that could have soured. Such exchanges were always sharpened by pain and cold, and there was plenty of both to go around. But no sooner had Jesse said the words than he turned back a sudden change of expression, tightening his grip ever so slightly and forcing the Fae to a stop. "I'm sorry," he said, so softly the others had to lean closer. "You told me not to run up the leg." "Yes, I told you not to run up the leg," Eden interrupted sharply, his eyes flashing from one to the next. "And I told you to run into the forest. And I might have added that when faced with a monster, it's probably not the best idea to throw books. And if you had both just listened to me—" They bowed their heads like schoolchildren, waiting for the rest. "There's a chance none of us would be alive." It seemed there was not a sound in the forest. They lifted their eyes slowly, convinced they had somehow misheard. But angry as the Fae had been before, racked as he was with that hideous burn, there was nothing in his face but the honest truth. It seemed there was one thing great enough to break through even an immortal's pride. At least some immortals. At least this immortal. For a fleeting moment, there seemed a great hope in it, like their quiet council in the forest had become about something greater than themselves. For a fleeting moment, each of them felt it. "Or perhaps we'd be a lot better off," he finished with a shrug. "Who's to say?" With an ironic smile, he continued walking, leaving the others frozen behind him on the sunlit trail. They stared after him in perfect silence, any words they might have replied catching in their throats. After a few seconds had passed, Jesse shook his head, muttering under his breath. "We just need to make it to the water, then everything will be fine." She glanced at him in surprise. "He's made a believer of you? You think he's going to magically heal?" The shifter shook his head. "I think I'm going to drown him." They continued walking for the better part of the afternoon, much longer than it had taken to climb the mountain in the first place, even though they were now walking downhill. Instead of getting easier as the sun made its lazy descent, things began to get harder. The aching was setting in, that cruel cousin of the sharper pains that first speared into them soon would become stiffness. And through it all, there was the matter of blood. The Fae had lost too much blood. "Shall we rest a moment?" Kiera suggested quietly, when the sight of him trying to press forward finally became too much. "It's been hours. I'd love to take a break." It was a lesson she'd learned in the nursery, in the schoolyard, in the tavern. Men accepted what they needed only when it came at someone else's request. But while the Fae's inherent pride might have made him an easy target for such a ploy, that eternal intuition did not, and there was something greater driving him, a quiet sense of urgency to reach his destination, much sharper and more pressing than it had been before. "We have to be close," he breathed in reply, leaning heavily upon the shifter as chills swept over his skin. A fever was setting in, and the blanket he'd packed against the wound was soaked through. There were banks of pressed soil, a dusting silt on the breeze. It must be. All at once he went quiet, turning like a bizarre divining rod towards a particular slice of the forest no different than the rest. His body wilted with relief as he let out a faltering breath. "Thank the gods." The others followed his gaze. A sparrow stared back, curious. "Oh, sweetheart, that monster broke something in your head." That's wonderful, honey." Kiera squeezed his arm, one of the only undamaged parts left on his body. She winced from the pain in her wrist, but chose to ignore it. Her pain was minimal in comparison. "It's lovely in this part of the woods. I'm feeling better already." The Fae turned slowly to face her as she swatted Jesse behind his back. It's really nice." The shifter forced an encouraging smile, easing his friend away from the patch of rocks he discovered and back towards the mountain's trail. We can talk more about it tonight, once we find a place to camp. In the meantime, how about we—" A splash of water echoed behind him. "What just—" Kiera's pulse stilled, then quickened, like one too quickly awoken from a dream. In a kind of daze, she rotated around and saw something that should have been impossible. She saw a cheerful stream bubbling over the rocks, where before there had been nothing but moss and sand. "By the stars," she gasped, borrowing a phrase the Fae was fond of himself. "How did that just—" She trailed off in wonder, the sunlight glinting off the water, dancing in her dazzled eyes. Jesse stared with parted lips, like he'd been caught mid-prayer. You knew that was going to happen?" Eden leveled them with a dry glare. "Would you really like to know, or would you rather brand me as a fool and set up camp somewhere? You could always call me Honey again. That was precious." The pair couldn't even summon the breath to reply. They simply stood there, dumbstruck, until Kiera turned with the obvious question. "How will this heal you?" The Fae limped forward, eyes on the rippling waves. "The stream will not. It is the maidens who live inside." Maidens who live inside water." Her mouth fell open in shock. "Naiads!" she exclaimed, half stunned that such things were actually real. Her eyes shot back to the water, like they might be there already. "You're saying that naiads are going to heal you?" Eden nodded faintly, never taking his eyes from the stream. "If they are feeling generous, and if the two of you will ever leave," he added under his breath. They shot him a questioning look. "They will not reveal themselves to you, mortal scum," he explained with a false grimace of apology. "There's a bend in the river further on. You can get yourselves cleaned up and perhaps find us something to eat for dinner. I shall meet you when my business here is finished." Kiera backed away slowly, wishing desperately to get a glimpse of the strange creatures before she left. Jesse took an automatic step to follow, then stopped just as fast. "I'm not leaving you here," he said bluntly. Since they'd begun their journey down the mountain, his arm had been permanently circled around the Fae's side. Even now, the two were standing together, joined at the hip, as if bonded by some kind of invisible glue. Much as he'd also have liked to see the naiads, Kiera suspected this was not the only reason. She bit her lip with a smile, as Eden glanced over with a touch of surprise. "I will be fine. Why do you linger?" Jesse clenched his jaw, as if the Fae was being particularly dense. "You were just burnt to the bone fighting against some hellish monster. In my defense, I might add. Now you want me to leave you standing on the banks of a rather spontaneous-looking river in the hopes that your beloved nature spirits will somehow bring you back to life." Eden stared a moment, then blinked. "I honestly don't see the question. Look!" Kiera pointed without restraint, standing on the tips of her toes, as the water rippled and a head of bluish hair glided into view. If she hadn't known what was coming, it might have been supremely disturbing. As it stood, she watched in wonder as a lovely woman rose from the depths. "Oh, you are lovely. And strange." Even looking directly at her, it was hard to differentiate where the water ended and the woman began. They blended into one another, rippling and shifting and glinting in the sun. Only her eyes remained constant, shockingly blue and fixed without blinking on the Fae. "My lord, what troubles you?" He bowed his head respectfully, then stepped into a patch of light, the shifter moving like an awkward statue at his side. The naiad's eyes widened with sorrow, then flashed up the mountain with alarming speed, like a fish darting through the shoals. "We felt the creature coming," she hissed between her teeth. "The stench of it leached through the earth. My sisters and I waited until it was gone. You have killed it?" Eden smiled and tilted his head. "Not I, but this one here." Kiera flamed with a scorching blush as the naiad's delicate eyebrows rose into her hairline. Her surprise was so palpable it might have been insulting, but at the last moment she smiled. "You have saved us, then." With her natural grace, she lifted herself further out of the water, tendrils of blue hair draped upon shimmering skin. "Come here, child, and be blessed." "Really?" Eden nodded with an encouraging smile, and Kiera approached, standing awkwardly on the bank of the river before the girl motioned for her to kneel. She did so without thinking, watching a slim silhouette glide closer across the water, until all at once she felt a cool hand on her cheek. "May you always find comfort when you need it, and may aid travel on swift horses should trouble arise." The naiad's voice rang like a chime upon the water, bright as the bubbling current splashing over the stone. "Take heart, sweet girl, for you have slain a great monster." The hand vanished, replaced with the softest kiss. "My sisters and I will not forget." Kiera waited until she moved away, then pushed slowly to her feet, backing away from the water as a trembling hand pressed to her cheek. She could still feel the naiad's lips, cool as the wind on a hot summer's day. In a way, it was the strangest thing to have happened. "Now leave this place." The naiad sank halfway back into the water, extending a slender arm to the fae. "What happens next is not for mortal eyes." Kiera and Jessie walked in silence through the forest, following the newly appeared river just as the fae had said. They came to a place where it curved suddenly, widening into a tranquil pool as the rest of the water tumbled into the woods and out of sight. A flowered breeze scented the air, and shafts of filtered sunlight made the canopy above them glow the purest sort of green. For a long while they merely stood there, struck by the tranquil beauty of such a place. "I might never have seen this," she thought suddenly, wrapping her arms in a thoughtless gesture around her ribs. "I might never have seen something like this ever again." The thought was so jarring, so quaking, that it brought instant tears to her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, then let out a silent breath when a pair of arms wrapped around her own. "You want to know something strange?" Jessie whispered. "When we were walking up the mountain, I kept thinking, things have been too quiet. We're due for something bad." She shivered in his arms, leaning back against him. "I was thinking the same thing." They stood there a while longer. There seemed no hurry to leave. For all they knew, Eden was deep in the hands of the lovely water spirits and would remain there for some time. It was only the stickiness of blood upon their skin that urged them forward. "Come on," Jessie spoke softly, leading her to the water's edge. "Let's get ourselves clean." Chapter 10. There was nothing quite like stepping into the cool bite of a high mountain stream. It cut to the core of you, locking down muscles and stealing the breath straight from your lungs. But, for all its altitude and sting, this stream felt a bit different. Not quite warm exactly, but not cold either. It felt like stepping into the arms of a friend, one that could carry your weight for a while. Kiera swore this was the naiads. Jessie said they'd lost too much blood. They bathed and laughed and splashed at each other until the ache of the day suddenly caught up with them and they dragged their weary bodies upon the pebbly shore. The sun had almost set, but there was still a pleasant warmth to the air, caught beneath the canopy of trees. "How are the wrists?" She glanced over in surprise, then quickly averted her gaze. She'd been thrown off a cliff, then battered by the accompanying landslide. She'd been chased by a beast risen from the depths of hell, only to fall over the same cliff once again. All that, and the only hurt to remind her was an aching in her wrists. "Thanks to you." "I won't be sparring anytime soon," she said lightly. His body stiffened in the corner of her eye. "I was surprised to see the two of you," he began tentatively, heart thudding unevenly in his chest. "I hadn't known that was something you were interested to learn." In spite of everything that had happened, she found herself on the verge of a smile. How swiftly their lives had begun changing. One second they were fleeing some nightmarish creature. Now they were chatting in the fading sun. This from a girl who had remained static her entire life. "Oh," she answered innocently. "I told you before the village that I wanted to be useful and pull my own weight. There might not always be a book lying around." She'd thought this to be quite funny, but he stared at the sky without a hint of expression, chewing on a question that had been hovering with increasing impatience on his mind. "Why did you not ask me?" The smile faded as she glanced at him a second time. The two were stretched side by side on the rocks, and while he never took his eyes from the sky, he'd clearly been wanting to ask the question for a while, waiting for the right moment. Monsters and landslides had a tendency to get in the way of such things. Because we kissed each other," she admitted quietly, wondering if it would have been better to lie. "Because I'm clumsy and awkward, and it's the first time I've even made a proper fist, and we kissed each other." She looked down shyly. "I didn't want you to see all that." In reality, they had done a great deal more than kiss, though they'd stopped before taking that final step, the one she'd never done before. They'd set out from Farian the very next morning and hadn't spoken of it since. Aside from a few fleeting glances, there had been nothing. He shifted slightly, rolling onto his side. "I wasn't sure if you wanted that to happen again," he answered softly. "There's been so much going on, and it never seemed the right time." His gaze lifted suddenly to hers, twinkling with a hint of that signature smile. "You've never made a proper fist?" She let out a sigh. "I thought you were supposed to... You know what? It doesn't matter. This is exactly what I mean. It's embarrassing not to know such a basic thing. I didn't want you to think me a fool." He gave her a long stare, 1,000 silent conflicts warring behind his eyes. Then, all at once, his expression cleared, and he seemed to make up his mind. "I have another question. Would you teach me to read?" She pulled back a few inches, blinking in surprise. It was not uncommon that someone from the villages wouldn't have learned such a skill. Most of the children who'd grown up in the mountain ranges were the same. The knowledge was simply unavailable, as there was no one around to teach. A few seconds passed, then a few more. She didn't answer, not directly. She merely pulled them together for a sudden kiss. When Eden returned to them in the later hours of the evening, there was a wildness to his eyes and a flush to his skin, like a fever had broken. He stepped out of the trees without a word to announce himself, giving them both a habitual smile before taking his place by the fire. Kiera was upon him in an instant. "Your shoulder!" she gasped in astonishment, pressing the tips of her fingers to the smooth, unblemished skin. "How did you—" "Naiads," he said simply, giving no further explanation. At any rate, it wasn't an explanation that would have been able to understand. Half the things that happened beneath that sparkling water were a mystery to his own people, drawing upon the ancient magic that was similar to, but still quite different from their own. Jessie leaned forward with a wicked smile. "If she had as many sisters as she implied, I could understand you being there a while. In your weakened condition, even a fae would need a little extra time." Idiot. A weakened condition wasn't something one would often use to tease a fae, not if they wanted to keep all their limbs connected to their body. But the two men had recently grown past such things. At the very least, all ensuing violence would be carried out cheerfully in the daylight. Eden laughed quietly, keeping his eyes on the jumping fire. "Are you asking for pointers, dog? Because I'm more than happy to oblige." Jessie pushed to his feet with a grin. "I'll be all right." With that, he tightened his cloak and slipped a blunted knife into his belt, one of the few blades to have survived its contact with the Blisserin's corrosive blood. "I'll take the first watch," he volunteered. "I don't know what river magic those women used on you, but odds are you should probably still get some rest." Eden bedded down with a nod, but Kiera leapt to her feet as well. "You shouldn't go alone," she cried. "What if there are more of those beasts out there? You heard the Fae. They can be perfectly silent if they wish." "There aren't any more of them," Jessie cut her off quickly. "Something felt wrong today, even as we were climbing. I should have listened to that feeling, but I don't have it anymore." She pulled her hands free when he reached for them. "A feeling?" she quoted sarcastically, her eyes flashing in the dim light. "That's what you're relying on to save your bloody life. A feeling." "There aren't any more of them," Eden echoed softly. "At least not around these parts. The Naiads would not have reappeared if that was the case. He will be safe as anywhere, I promise." She eyed him suspiciously. "Says the man who wants to sleep." He chuckled again, laying his head upon the blanket. "Yes, says the man who wants to sleep. So could we hurry this along, please? Not all of us have been lucky enough to have such an easy day as you." "Easy?" Kiera raised her eyebrows and turned to him slowly, wondering if he was still recovering enough that she could bash him with the same book she'd used before. If nothing else, the irony would be pleasingly symmetrical. She could write a song about it after. Something to sing as they... A pair of lips closed over hers. "I'll be back soon," Jessie said with a wink. "Try to get some rest." She froze in surprise. "Not likely." She was still staring after him when he disappeared into the trees, one hand half raised to her mouth that she could feel the echo of that disarming kiss. It wasn't until she turned back to the fire that she realized the Fae was watching too, his eyes twinkling in the dancing light. "It's been quite the day," he remarked innocently. "It certainly has." She settled down beside him, tucking the shifter's blanket absent-mindedly around his legs as she stared into the fire, drawing her knees to her chest. She never saw the way the Fae glanced down in amusement, then freed himself from the awkward entanglement. She never saw the way he tossed the cover back into the shifter's pack with a secret smile. "How are your wrists?" She glanced down with a start, extending them. Jessie had asked the same thing, but she hadn't given the question much thought until now, mostly because they were no longer leapt to attention. "They're actually not that bad," she murmured, surprised when she could turn them over. "I don't understand it. When I was swinging from the cliff, I felt the bones crack. I'm sure of it." Eden reached over for a look, then nodded to himself. "You can thank the sisters for that. They usually don't bestow such gifts upon mortals." As much as he hated to admit it, he was probably right. The second they'd taken those first steps into the cool water, the pain had subsided from a sharp sting to a dull ache, the kind of thing that could be managed through ale and humour. The Blisserin's claws had scraped Jessie's shoulder, but it had eased in the same way. She flashed a grin, quoting his earlier rebuke. "Mortal scum, right?" "Not my words," he deflected quickly. "But yes, absolutely." "And yet they blessed me," she said curiously, remembering the girl's strange words. Like all the mortals she'd met thus far, it was impossible to determine the age of her. But given the way each word had resonated in the forest, shimmering with a faint power, she'd guess it was quite old indeed. Eden glanced up with an unexpected smile. "That was a surprise to me as well, but greatly deserved." He'd stretched out his legs, resigned that he would not be allowed to sleep after all. "It has happened on occasion before. A reward for acts of bravery or selflessness, acts that befit the rest of the forest as well." She shook her head in confusion, and he shrugged. "They are stewards of such places, same as me." "Same as you. So you could bless me as well?" she asked eagerly, wondering why she hadn't considered the possibility before. Could you reward my stunning bravery as she did? He laughed softly, tilting back his head to the stars. I could. I won't. Why not? She demanded. I saved your life. You threw a book, he corrected, and my people do not hand down blessings so freely. Not for things such as that. And not usually to people like you. She leaned back in surprise, staring at him. Like most occasions when she found herself wanting to slap him, the Fae hadn't intended any offense. He was merely answering her question, the same way he found himself casually offended by both the shifter and the barmaid every single day. People like me, she repeated in a murmur, deciding to be offended on principle, although she hid it well. And tell me, what is so terrible about us mortals? His laughter rang out again, brightening the forest around it. Nothing. I happen to like you mortals very much. But the rest of your kind, she pressed, refusing to let him deflect as he tended to do so easily. What do the rest of your kind hold against us? Why are we in constant rebuke? His eyes flashed to hers, and she sensed he was abridging his answer. Sure enough, when he finally gave it, the words were short and pithy, said with a smile. You mean besides the general murder, havoc, and destruction? That and the fact that your people seem to spread like flies. She raised her eyebrows. And your people haven't done any of that. There was a pause. We are prettier about it. This time she burst out laughing herself, surrendering to it completely until at last the two were quiet once again, staring with thoughtful smiles into the flickering fire. After a long while, she glanced at him again. Eden, back on the mountain, I didn't freeze. I was frightened, just like you said. I was absolutely terrified. Never in my life have I seen such a thing. But I didn't freeze. It was a perplexity that had eluded her until that very moment, slipping in and out of focus, before leaping to sudden prominence in the other front of her mind. Why hadn't she? When she'd done so on every other occasion, when this was by far the worst thing that had happened to date. He held her gaze a moment, then smiled, that bright gaze drifting into the forest where the shifter had vanished not long ago. Perhaps you merely found something you felt more. The magic of the naiads had most assuredly saved the Fae's life, but, as it became clear the next morning, it had not completely healed him. From the moment he opened his eyes, squinting into the sun, the bright promise of that new dawn seemed doomed to fail. By all the hells, he said irritably, pushing himself upright and rubbing painfully at the hollow of his shoulder. I should have jumped off that cliff right along with you. To be honest, she'd found it difficult to sleep. Tired as she was, her eyes kept drifting to where the shifter had lain not long before. He was gone now, undoubtedly refilling their flasks of water, but he'd slept scarcely longer than she'd managed to do herself. By all the hells, she quoted teasingly. Just how many hells are there? 7, the Fae answered without thinking, continuing to massage his shoulder. A second later, he flashed her a suspicious look. Everyone knows this. She raised a hand to identify herself. Mortal scum, remember? How could I forget? He muttered, lifting himself higher. The second he was vertical, a trickle of blood slipped down from his hairline. He lifted a hand in dismay, watching as it bloomed into a giant stain on his new shirt. Now where did that come from? He demanded. Have you and that infernal shifter been cutting me in my sleep? Sounds like a beautiful start to a beautiful morning. The two glanced up as Jessie swept out of the trees and into the campsite, flashing a quick grin at Kiera before tossing a flower onto her pack. She stared in surprise. It looked as though he'd done it without even thinking, but he grinned again when she casually pressed it to her nose. Are all dogs this cheerful? Eden asked tersely. Or is it only you? Instead of replying, Jessie knelt down with a frown, actually pushing away the Fae's hand so he could see the area for himself. I thought they healed this. The skin is already smooth. Eden pushed his hand away, much harder than he had been done to himself. They healed the worst of it and saved my life, but there is still much tearing beneath the surface. He flexed the arm gingerly in front of him. I wonder if I'll be able to swing a blade. Jesse stared a moment, then stood up with sudden determination. You won't have to, he said swiftly, bending down to grab both the Fae's satchel and his own. I can scout ahead, find the easiest way down to the valley. From there, the land is flat. Kiera hopped up as well, still holding the flower. I can go with you. I mean, if you'd like some company. The two shared a shy smile as the Fae glowered in between. This is nauseating. Ignore him, Jesse said plainly, extending his arm. I'd love the company, seeing as you're the one who saved us. While this one did nothing but disfigure himself, it's the safest option. She bit down on her lip, trying very hard not to grin. That's absolutely true, she agreed, skipping lightly across the clearing to drape her arm through his. You forgot to add how disgusting he looked at the worst of it. I didn't forget. I could never forget. The two laughed amongst themselves, traipsing out of the campsite and down the forest trail like two children. They'd already lost sight of the fire when the Fae called out to them. You two have fun. I'll just be here, bleeding. The second the pair found themselves completely alone, those teasing grins faded, and the shyness returned. Far from talking, they seemed almost unable to look at each other. That flower hung like a challenge between them, daring either of them to try. So, you never answered my question, he began casually, shoving aside some branches so she could walk underneath. Would you teach me how to read? Her breathing hitched, but she kept her eyes forward. I never answered your question, she echoed innocently. I believe that I did. His cheeks burned as he lowered his eyes to the trail. I suppose you did. The silence rang out between them, louder with each step. It was harder to escape such a thing in the woods, she was coming to realize. The wide-open expanse might have appeared deceptively freeing, but in reality, one travelled in a tight circle with their companions. There was no escape. There was no shying away from unanswered questions. But perhaps that is all right. Perhaps it is even better. And what about me? She added suddenly. Will you teach me how to fight? He glanced over in surprise. Do you want that? He asked, looking directly at her for the first time. There would never be a need to feel embarrassed. You're just starting. I could certainly tell you some stories about when I began to learn myself, but I would understand your reasons if you wanted to start with Eden. She considered for a moment, then flashed an unconcerned smile. I think between your lessons and the Fae's, there won't be a warrior in the realm who'll be able to touch me. You've seen how terribly effective I am without even touching a blade. He bowed his head with a nod, spilling his dark hair between them. It was a boyish move, one that warmed her with affection, one that wasn't quite fast enough to hide his secret smile. Ah, yes, I remember. He casually wrapped his arm around her shoulder, settling there carefully, like he was testing the feel. But we can't always live on the edge of a cliff, can we? She stopped moving, gazing up at him. Can't we? Faster than sight, the two came together, crashing with more force than they'd intended, and tangling harder than that. Her mouth flew open, then his was upon it, hands twisting into knots of hair as they pressed their faces together, spinning and falling in the depths of an endless kiss. Then they were spinning and falling for real. She detached long enough to let out a breath of laughter as the two staggered off the beaten trail and tumbled down the grass hill. Ferns and blankets of cool moss cushioned their landing, but it could have been hot stone, and the pair would not have noticed. For longer than either was fully aware, they had been waiting for this moment. They would wait no longer. The time had come. Clothes ripped and landed beside them. With a skill that she would come to question in later days, Jessie reached between them and quickly unlaced the knots of string holding up her shirt. In a flash, it was over her head and landing beside the other. Skin pressed against skin as he lay her back on the ground and moved himself lower, those warm lips feeding hungrily upon the smooth lines of her neck, her collarbones, her chest. Her back arched, and he drew her even closer, lifting her just as suddenly and placing her on his lap. Her legs opened without thinking, wrapping in a tight circle around his waist as he reached again between them, pulling open the front of his pants. "I have wanted this," he panted against her throat. "I have wanted this for so long." She didn't have the breath to answer. Her skin was hot and pulsing, and her long hair was draped like a fiery scarf down the length of his back. It was a place she had never yet ventured, a line she had never yet crossed, and with dizzying speed she raced towards it now. But all that changed when he reached down between them once again. "What am I doing?" She froze when his fingers touched her, then pulled away with a rush of cold air. "I can't," she blurted without thinking, hating herself just as fast. "I'm sorry, I can't." He pulled back, breathless and surprised. A look of confusion flashed across his face, chased by something sharper, a flickering hint of fear. Then, in a rush, he was nodding. "Of course," he panted, raking back his hair and avoiding her eyes. "It's fine, don't ever apologize. We can just stop." "Can we?" For the second time, they crashed into each other. This time, it was she who initiated it. He was willing, but unsure, following her speed and her direction. He caught her lightly when she leapt on top of him, then allowed himself to be lowered to the ground. She paused for a moment on top of him, the tips of her hair tickling his chest. "What now?" Her body was tensed with anticipation, aching to race forward once again, but every other part of her went still the second she saw him, dazzled as always by his beauty, terrified as ever what might happen if they were to proceed. "Remember how you said there was no need to feel embarrassed?" she whispered. He nodded faintly, and she pulled in a breath. "The thing is, I've never done this before." His eyes widened ever so slightly in surprise. Then, in a single instant, that gnawing fear vanished into a look of such tenderness, it lit the corners of her heart. "You haven't?" She shook her head, cheeks flaming with a blush. "Would it be all right if we slowed things down?" she ventured tentatively, risking a quick look at him. "Maybe we could just lie here for a while. You could kiss me again?" He did the best thing she could imagine. He smiled. "Of course it's all right." He opened his arms invitingly, and she slipped inside. Some of the heat was gone, but that warmth remained. They adjusted a moment to get comfortable, then he pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "We can do whatever you like, and I will never need convincing to kiss you. It occupies my every moment. I think about it all the time." She relaxed with a silent breath, cupped around his chest, thrilling back to life at those simple words. They were quiet a little while, then he stroked back a lock of hair. "There was never anyone back in your village?" he asked quietly. "You told me that you didn't have someone steady, but I just assumed." She shook her head. Somehow it didn't feel embarrassing anymore. "Most people assumed, and they left me alone because of it. But I never felt so strongly about anyone," she admitted, blushing once again. "I just wanted it to be different, I guess." Not until later would she second-guess the words, praying he didn't think she'd meant those feelings were different now. But he didn't seem to take any offense, nor did he seem to think a door was closing forever. He simply fitted himself around her, repeating that steady, patient vow. "We can do anything you like, for however long you'd like to." He glanced down with an impish smile. "You'll remember from Farian. There's plenty that can occupy us in the meantime." She bit her lip, peering up at him. "Did something happen in Farian? I can't remember." His eyebrows rose in mock concern. "You can't? That's terrible." He slipped a hand between them, running it up along the inside of her thigh. "I'd be glad to help you remember." A cluster of voices sounded through the trees, and the pair froze, clasping hands over each other's mouths as they turned suddenly in the same direction. It was quiet for a moment, so quiet they convinced themselves they'd imagined it. Then, all at once, they sounded again. "Who is that?" With the instinctual caution of two people who'd recently found themselves running from an actual monster, they lifted their heads slowly, peering through a gap in the ferns. In their tumble down the mountain, they'd gotten closer to the valley than they'd thought, close enough to glimpse something they'd missed on their climb to the peak, angled precisely away from their original trail. They stared a moment longer, then spoke at the same time. "We should get Eden." The Fae was already halfway down the mountain path as they raced back up to him, walking at a measured speed with a hand braced against his shoulder. The two groups collided in the middle of the woods, staring at each other in surprise. "What are you doing?" Jesse chided, eyeing the new stain of blood on his tunic. "I said that we'd come back for you." "Why? So you could carry me?" the Fae answered bitingly. He might have delighted in informing the others of his newfound martyrdom, but wouldn't allow himself to be treated like an invalid, no matter the cause. "Besides, I figured the two of you were off making children, and I should probably save the world by myself." He followed this up with a devilish smile, but even though the words had struck far too close to home, their faces could register nothing but worry and shock. "What's the matter?" he asked abruptly. "Why do you look like that?" Kiera threw a quick glance over her shoulder. "We found some people in the trees." The Fae tensed ever so slightly. "Travelers?" Jesse shook his head. "A village alongside the water." Whatever Eden was expecting, it certainly hadn't been that. He glanced instinctively over their shoulders, as surprised as they'd been when those first voices echoed through the trees. It was silent for a second, then his lips curved with the beginnings of a smile. "Well, that sounds perfect." Chapter 11. It wasn't a village so much as a little fishing hamlet, nestled into the bank of a freshwater cove. No more than a few dozen people, all of whom were nervous to meet a shifter and astonished to glimpse a Fae. The whispers were abundant, the staring was even worse, but they were warm and inviting, with bright eyes and sweet faces, always heaping on a bit more hospitality, though they had little to begin with, always asking if their esteemed visitors required anything more. Kiera adored them. She went from person to person, from hut to hut, led by a gaggle of enthusiastic children, eagerly viewing every insignificant thing they dragged her off to see. The grove of cedars where they strung up the briny nets to be untangled, the long slats of wood where they cut the fish, warmed by the sun and smoothed by the constant breeze. She was the only one who didn't feel the need to rush off the second they'd arrived, the only one who remained blissfully unpressed for time. The Fae had wanted to set out immediately, chart a passage on one of the fishing boats, and save days of time by cutting through the cove. But the shifter had convinced him to stay another day, citing the need for recovery, while really he couldn't stand to see the look of disappointment in Kiera's eyes. Eden saw through this immediately, but consented to a single night. The two had struck up an inexplicable bond since that day in the meadow, each left with memories of the other they were unable to ignore. The Fae sprinting up the side of a monster in a reckless bid to save his friend's life, and the shifter staying beside him in those final moments, able to escape the creature stalking towards them, but unwilling to leave the Fae alone to die. It attended and surprised them at the same time, leaving both caught between bursts of shared laughter and then brusque dismissals when they felt they'd strayed too close. Such is the way of men. Kiera left them to it, walking along beside the waves with a smile on her face. Strange as it was, considering they were in the middle of nowhere, she felt as though she ought to start writing things down. A journal of sorts, to mark the phases of a quickly changing life. My village caught fire and I ran screaming through the trees. The wagons ignored my cries for help, and I blacked out in the middle of the road. When I opened my eyes... She paused there, gaze drifting further up the shore. I met a boy. As it turned out, she was not the only one charmed with village life. He had left the Fae to his brooding and joined the children she'd just left upon the beach. There was some kind of game they were playing, tossing a series of leather balls back and forth between them. Every time one of them landed on a wet stone, the whole group of them would scream with laughter. When a little girl fell and cut her knees, Jesse scooped her up and proceeded to play with her, riding upon his back. She smiled to herself, watching from a distance. What can I say about Jessie? It seemed such a ridiculous thing, that she would find herself contemplating the prospect of romance at that particular moment in her life. Since the day she'd moved into the tavern, there had been a constant supply of willing and eager men. Even Marcel, when he'd first been hired, had made the obligatory move, but she'd never noticed any of them. Not the way she noticed Jessie. It was like he was performing, but didn't know it, as if she'd wandered off the street and into the audience, settling down on the benches just to watch. Only a short while they'd known each other, but already she had memorized every line and every angle, each of his fleeting expressions and the different tones of his smile, the exact hue of his skin in sunlight and the silver glow of his eyes in the shade, the sound of his laughter when it rang out through the forest, and the way he watched her, the same as she was watching him. She was captivated by him, even having escaped a dragon's fire, even having travelled with a starlit warrior. She found herself captivated by the teenage shifter she slept beside every night. He would wait for you, but would you make him? Her smile faded as she considered the question anew. It was easier to think now that she'd gotten a little distance, but the answer was no clearer to her than it was just a few hours before, when they'd tangled together in the ferns. She cared for him, desperately. She'd had dreams of his body pressing against hers. And yet, we've known each other a few weeks. Most of that time, we've been running from things intent upon killing us. If that wasn't the case, if we'd simply met one day in the village, would he even have asked my name? Another chorus of squeals echoed over the shore, and she turned suddenly on her heel, walking away from the scene and towards the little hut where they'd been invited to stay the night. Eden was already there, propped up on the windowsill and watching the spectacle as well. A faint smile played around his lips as his eyes followed along with their game. Most days, he would have been the very first to join them, but a Blisserin's burn wasn't the easiest thing to shake, and he was using the time to do exactly what the shifter had advised, resting and gathering his strength. He glanced up when she opened the door, flashing a welcoming smile. "Your wolf has gone feral," he remarked without preamble, tilting his head towards the window. "They should get the children out of there before he works up an appetite." She smiled in return, but her time on the beach had left her feeling unexpectedly cold. With a little shiver, she pulled a blanket around her and began rummaging in Jessie's pack. "We have a little time. I thought I'd crack these open." She pulled out the smaller of the histories, only to find the upper corner burnt through with the blood of the Blисserin. She jerked her hand back, staring for a moment before reaching again into the satchel. "Perhaps the other." Eden's eyes twinkled across the room. "You are an odd girl. I like you immensely." She set it down on her legs, tracing with the utmost care. "I've never owned a book," she confessed. "There were a handful in the tavern where I worked, just silly stories, but I wore them out." It lay heavy in her lap, just as she'd always imagined it might. The leather-bound cover was frayed in certain places, but considering it survived the attack same as she, it was in fine condition. "You never owned a book?" the Fae repeated softly, staring across the room. There was a slight hesitation. "Forgive the question, but how did you learn to read?" She met his eyes, staring back without shame. There was a woman who came by the village every month, as she travelled between the local markets and her husband's farm. She would set up beside the well, and we would circle around as she took us through the letters, taught us to make the sounds. I don't know how she did it, but she always brought something new with her. I never realized how strange that was until now." Eden listened in silence, then flashed a tight smile. "Perhaps she'd borrowed them from a library." Kiera nodded faintly. "Yes, perhaps." Her eyes drifted again to the gold lettering on the cover, glinting faintly in the dappled light. "They weigh much more than I thought. I'm lucky Jessie is willing to carry them." The Fae leaned back with a secret grin. "I think Jessie would carry a great many things for you." Subtle. "So what about you?" she asked briskly, changing the subject. "I have no doubt you were taught to read, but how is it that you speak the common tongue so well?" It was something of an anomaly. Despite having been alive for centuries, the Fae moved in tight circles and spoke few other languages than their own. There were older languages, ancient tongues that were still used among the immortals, but despite how widespread it had become, the common tongue wasn't one of them. Perhaps they considered it a fad and didn't wish to bother. Perhaps they simply assumed people would adapt and begin learning their own. It had happened on many occasions. Most children were taught a basic Fae vocabulary, no matter how remote their township or village, telling phrases like, "My mother sent me for food," or "The river has swollen its banks and we need help." Last spring, a baby in Kiera's own village had been given a Fae name in attempts to add a little prestige. The parents had been so relentlessly bullied by the others that they'd quickly switched it for a mortal name instead, pretending it was their intention all along. "How do I speak the common tongue so well?" Eden shook his head with an unexpected chuckle. "The same reason that I've allowed myself to become trapped with two insufferable children in the middle of the woods." A deflection. Interesting. "If we asked someone else," she pressed, "what would they say?" She'd found this was often the best way to approach him, through the lens of others, since he was so unwilling to share things himself. He considered a moment, then sighed. "They would say I have become abnormally intertwined with the mortal world. They think this to be folly," he added. "It's the reason I was cursed to this never-ending camping trip." She nodded seriously. "Instead of drinking and whoring with the rest of your kind." He gave her a wink. "Exactly." The door swung open abruptly, and they both glanced up as Jessie swept gracefully into the room. His hair was windswept, and his boots were muddy. The little girl who'd been riding on his shoulders had left the faint outline of a kiss on his cheek. "Don't call us children," he warned, blowing into his hands before crossing the room to warm them by the flames. "You might be ancient, but you look no older than I do." "That's because you don't always know how to look," Eden said dismissively, though he flashed the wolf a boyish grin. "Did you have fun with the children? I'm surprised you didn't play fetch." The shifter nodded without looking. "That's hilarious. Who knew the Fae had such a keen sense of humour?" He glanced up before they could answer. "I'm seriously asking, because no one has ever said that." Kiera shut the book with a loud clap. "Why did I ever think I'd ever get to read this?" "Are you two going to keep jabbing at each other?" she asked sharply. "Or are we going to discuss the plan for what happens next? Because I'd be perfectly willing to leave you both here." "I chartered us passage on ship," Jessie interrupted. looking mighty pleased with himself for doing so. All we need do in exchange is to leave the Fae. I instantly agreed. He glanced between them with a grin. See? There's no reason we can't make plans and jab each other at the same time. Eden ignored this, lightly jumping down from the window. Did you actually charter us passage? With one of the fishing crews? With one of the fishing boats, Jessie replied. But we don't have a crew to sail it. It's just a small craft. More of a rowboat, really. But it's needed by a village on the far side of the cove anyway. They said that if we take it across, we can do it for free. Sounds good to me. Kiera slipped the book into the shifter's pack and glanced with sudden longing at the bed. How long since she'd actually slept in one? So we'll leave first thing in the morning then. Get a little sleep? The men nodded in unison, looking as eager for a mattress as she was. Without another word, they stamped out the fire and began settling down for the night. It might have actually been a pleasant evening if the Fae hadn't made a last-second offer to leave. Just because of the sex, he explained innocently, ducking the pillow that Jessie hurled towards his head. Just so I won't be lying here when you two start to have sex. One day, very soon, I am going to kill him. The friends got up very early the next morning, as early as the fishermen were getting up themselves. They waved a cheerful goodbye, secretly pleased that despite having refused any compensation, the villagers would soon find the money Eden had left for them, and headed down towards the shoreline to board their promised boat. Upon later reflection, boat was a rather generous term. This is it? Kiera asked with supreme hesitation, wondering if it would be able to hold their combined weight. This isn't possibly the backup boat, the one they built to make all the other boats feel better about themselves. Eden chuckled and stepped aboard, while Jessie flashed a rueful grin. I'm so sorry it isn't up to your golden standards, m'lady, he replied. Perhaps you can make a quick 5-day run through the forest and meet Eden and me on the other side. She narrowed her eyes, sensing he might not exactly be sincere. It won't sink? It won't sink, he promised, offering a gallant arm. Shall we? I guess. Fortunately, the boat turned out to be sturdier than it looked, gliding into the water like a fish itself as they drifted further into the bay. The sun had risen, but it was still battling its way through the night's fog. Swirling clouds of mist rolled in great sweeps across the water. The image swept in and out with it, frosting opaque before suddenly clearing with bright points of piercing light. That same light seemed to be pulling them forward, out of the bank and into an endless sky. Kiera leaned against the side of the boat, resting her chin in her hands. It's so beautiful. She stared at the flocks of ivory birds standing along the shoreline, larger than any she'd ever seen, picking their way slowly across the rocks. Every now and then, one of them would startle and lift suddenly into the air, casting shade over the others with a pair of truly massive wings. What are those? She asked curiously, leaning closer for a better view. Eden shot a cursory glance over his shoulder. Herons, he replied, and waved them off dismissively. They're originally from a place called Lithia, but they came in with the merchants and spread everywhere. Nowadays they're a kind of pest. Lovely pest. She continued to stare as they glided past the last of them, unexpectedly startled when one of them turned suddenly and stared back with a pair of knowing, almost human eyes. That gaze held until the bird vanished into the mist, but she continued to think of it long after. Sometimes she wondered if her world was opening up too quickly. How had she found herself in such a place, sitting on a rowboat with a shifter and a fae, off to see a man about a dragon in some far-off adventurous place? It sounded like something from one of the stories that women used to read her by the well. Sometimes she wanted to go back to her village and take time to process, to catch her breath and recenter before coming back for more. Then she'd remember her village wasn't there anymore. Do not think about that now. It was the same mantra that had carried her from the remains of Cattaling, clearing her immediate focus and allowing her to breathe. Stray too deep down that hole, and it was possible she'd never find her way back again. Better to live in the moment. Better to plan the next steps. "Perhaps this is the best way to defeat a dragon," she said offhandedly, stretching out her legs as the sun warmed her face. "Perhaps we should simply stay by the water." The men shared a quick smile, taking turns with the oars. "Relaxing, is it?" Eden quipped, rotating the paddle despite the fact that same shoulder had nearly burned from his body. "Having someone row you across the waters?" She flashed a grin, that fiery hair dancing in the misty breeze. "You know I offered to help." "Don't bother," Jesse interrupted cheerfully, upping his speed. "It's a fine lesson for every fae. Teaches them a little humility." Eden glanced over his shoulder, looking like there were several other lessons he'd be happy to teach the shifter, but he merely chopped back his oar, splashing him instead. It was a strange little fellowship, one the villagers would be talking about long after they'd left. Travellers weren't an uncommon sight, even in such thick wilderness, but they tended to stick with their own kind. Companies of fae drifted together, shifters roamed the woods in packs. People like Kiera tended to stay home, safe behind the walls of their villages. Rarely did they blend together. "Their loss, our gain." She skimmed her hands along the water, letting her fingers dip beneath the waves. They were already more than halfway across the sparkling water. Only a few more minutes and they'd be gliding onto the rocky shore on the other side. "So, you never told us how you came to Farian," she began conversationally, cutting her nail across the water and following the tiny arch that trailed behind. "If you come from a place so far away, you must have set out there with some purpose. Although, I suppose after you've had years merely to wander," she added almost as an afterthought, "and there aren't many places you haven't been." How many years? That was the question, and one she'd always been too nervous to ask the fae outright. There seemed something almost uncouth about it. Perhaps one day. Eden let out a little sigh, the way he always did when she berated him with such questions. "Would you like me to answer?" he replied shortly. "You seem to have figured out all the answers already for yourself." She ignored this, gaze drifting glassily into the sky. "Yes, you must have been to every corner of the realm," she murmured dreamily, forgetting her plans to live permanently upon the water and deciding to travel instead. From the famed trees of the Black Forest all the way to the western shore. Eden threw her another glance, but Jesse shook his head with a grin. "There is no need to answer. She is leagues away." "Farian seems such an odd place to stop by comparison," she continued, flicking her fingers once more beneath the waves. "Of course, you can't spend every moment." There was a sudden pause in the rowing. "Kiera, get your hand out of the water." She turned to the fae with a lazy grin. "Why, is there another of your beloved naiads?" "No." There was movement beneath her, and she jerked back her hand with a start, peering into the waves just in time to see a flash of silver scales disappear into the murky depths. That's when her heart started pounding. "Seven hells!" she gasped, scrambling back into the boat. "Was that some kind of snake?" "Relax, it's gone," Jesse soothed, though he kept his eyes on the water. "And it's small. I've heard they can get a lot bigger than that." "Bigger?" she shrieked. "The thing was longer than our boat." When no one challenged this, she proceeded to put her head between her knees, hyperventilating into her hands. "I always envied people who travel, but I don't anymore. It's merely one terror after the next." The shifter pursed his lips sympathetically, increasing his speed to put distance between them and whatever creatures might be frolicking underneath. But Eden kept his troubled gaze on the water, gazing towards the horizon with the ghost of a frown. "It isn't always like this," he murmured. "It hasn't been like this in a long time." Chapter 12. The friends piled out of the boat the second it scraped the rocky shore, passing it quickly into the hands of the villagers and heading back into the safety of the trees. Safety of the trees had become a relative comparison. They'd been safely in the trees when they'd encountered a Blisseren, but none of them was particularly inclined to risk the aquatic side of things. All those shadowy cousins with their unblinking eyes and scales. The prospect of dry land was more inviting. And, as Kiera was continually discovering, there were sparks of light amongst the shadows. It happened by accident, when they were on a rare break and Jessie was scouting further ahead. She had just sat down to drink some water, when she realized that the Fae had vanished as well. A rush of nerves swept over her before she heard his musical voice drifting in the trees. With some strange compulsion, she pushed back to her feet, weaving tentatively beneath the greenlit canopy as she made her way towards him. It was a different kind of forest than the forest she'd known before. None of the lines were so clear as the trees with their neat spaces and the lolling bed of needles in between. Those forests were like a bed of arrows, all pointing straight and predictable towards the sun. Everything in these woods was dense and compact, seeping with life and energy, but all of it held fast beneath the twisting weave of branches that curved high overhead. The shade was thick and smelled of cooler things, frogs wailing from their muddy burrows and sheaths of dew long since expired. Every so often, the image was splintered with sudden shafts of piercing sunlight that shocked the green and dazzled the eyes, transecting the expanse into smaller places, like puzzles just waiting to connect. More than anything, it was the quiet that struck Kiera as she wandered on tiptoe over the soft beds of moss and sudden flailing of roots. It was the kind of quiet you'd find in a library or a house of prayer. The kind that echoed some anticipation, heralding the discovery of something new. Eden was standing with his back to her, cupping something delicately in his hands. "Step softly," he murmured without looking. "There is much here to protect." She paused mid-stride, then glanced beneath her boots for the first time. The path was clear, nothing but smooth earth to pave the way. She continued carefully, picking her way to his side. "What are you doing?" Her voice softened instinctively, and she felt almost rude to disturb him. But the Fae glanced over with a little smile, then showed her the vibrant flower resting in his hands. Not the flower, she realized with a start, but the tiny creature inside it. "Can you see it?" he asked, sounding very curious. Her lips parted with a sudden gasp as she leaned closer to the flower, staring with eyes wide as saucers at the little wonder nestled inside. "Of course I can," she breathed. "But what is it?" At a glance, it looked almost like a pixie, but it was even smaller in frame, so small it was trembling. Every inch of its spindly body dusted the color of new buds in the spring. Its eyes were wildly disproportionate and stared up at her without blinking, seeming to reflect the whole of the rest inside them. They blinked once before drifting back to Eden. The Fae inclined his head with a little smile, giving silent reassurances that all was safe. "It's a work in progress," he answered softly, lifting a finger to steady it. "They can't talk yet, but we call them dryads. They're very new to this place, newer even than you." He nudged her with a smile. "Dryads." She stared down in amazement, feeling as though she'd been let in on some privileged secret, the kind that only happened in such corners of the world where miracles sprang to life. "They can't speak yet," she echoed in a daze. "But they will." Eden nodded in silence, watching as the creature gazed up at the sun. "In time, if all goes well," he answered quietly, warming with a tender smile. "They're very delicate. We're not sure how best to protect them." Her eyes flashed up in alarm. "What do you mean?" "Men and shifters are settling this land, and creatures like this have no way of fighting back." He touched the petals back over it, like pulling up the blankets on a bed. They must be cared for. The flower nestled back amongst the others as a peculiar expression troubled his face. Men don't know how to care for things, he murmured. I've never known why that is. The two stood there another moment, staring in silence. Then they startled in perfect unison as the branches crashed behind them and a loud voice echoed through the trees. There you are! I've been looking for ages! Jesse was perched on a mossy tree stump, a long blade of whistling grass set absent-mindedly between his teeth. He raised his eyebrows impatiently, not understanding their expression. Are you ready? Come on, we're wasting daylight. He waited until they started moving, then hopped down. Eden, if you want to take some flowers with you, you'll have to carry them yourself. We're on a schedule. The Fae paused mid-step, staring at the back of the shifter's head with a look of strained patience. Kiera paused beside him, listening with a grin as he muttered under his breath. We wonder how best to protect them. Then all at once, the answer comes to me. A hand drifted casually to his bow. She swatted it down with a giggle. Perhaps we could find some middle ground. He scoffed with derision. Optimist. A second later, he swept past the shifter with a sweet smile, leaving Jesse staring after him incredulously as Kiera joined him on the trail. He's so moody, the shifter muttered, falling into step beside her. I never know what's going on in that demented little head. Kiera linked their arms together with a secret smile. A bit more than you might think. Perhaps it was because they'd wasted a day in the village, but the trio of companions pushed themselves harder than usual, making up for lost time. The forest had thinned once they made their way across the ravine. Otherwise, Kiera didn't know how she would have kept pace, but it was still grueling work, and by the time they decided to break for lunch, she was sore and winded. Of course, that's when Jesse walked over with a smile. Care for a lesson? She stared up at him, torn with indecision. Her feet throbbed, her knees ached, and she'd been looking forward to spending the better part of the hour picking brambles from her hair. But she couldn't resist that smile. Of course, she said with false cheer, forcing herself back up again. Why not? Not like a 5-hour hike should make a difference. Jesse brightened immediately, tying back his hair. That's exactly what I thought, he replied. The Fae's out hunting, it's as good a time as any. Besides, we'll need to work up an appetite for whatever he's decided to bring back. Given the urgency of their journey, and the fact that they were staying mostly off the grid, Eden had compromised a bit when it came to his dietary preferences. Compromised being the key word. When the Fae went hunting, he usually came back with berries and fish. They stood at opposite sides of the clearing, eyeing each other as the sun drifted across a distant peak. When the shadows slashed the ground between them, he took a step forward, lips quirked in a little smile, testing out the waters, though he never raised his hands. I don't know what to show you, he admitted. I don't know what Eden already taught. She shook her head quickly, still grappling with the basics. We were only at the beginning. That was our first lesson. The most important thing he taught me was that each fight must first be won inside a person's own mind. Jesse nodded slowly, admiring the Fae more with each passing day. That's a clever way to start, he murmured. I wouldn't have thought of such a thing. He regarded her for a moment. And how did he teach you that? He grabbed me, frightened me. She blushed even saying it, but held his gaze. He refused to let go until I worked through the panic and threw him off me. It was a strange thing to break, that mindset. I didn't know how strong it already held me until I cast it off. Jessie nodded again, eyes never leaving her. But I did it, she added suddenly, brimming with secret pride. I threw him to the ground. There was a little pause. Then he motioned her forward. Show me. For the next half hour, the two went through the same basic defenses she'd begun to practice with Eden, though there was something very different about moving against the shifter's hands. He was rough with her, but only enough to make her smile. He was gentle too, so gentle that at times she needed to chide him, reminding him the purpose was for her to learn. He would catch her in a chokehold, shifting his balance to various angles as she practiced the different ways to free herself. They would move in tandem, throwing synchronized punches, until she could find the rhythm in her sleep. Jab, and block. There was something fluid about the way he moved, same as Eden, but there was a primal power there as well, something that cut through the Fae's inherent grace with feral bursts of raw energy and speed. "Come on," he taunted, dancing just out of arm's reach. "You can do better." "Just look at you." In hindsight, it was a miracle she'd been able to focus long enough to absorb a single word he'd been saying. His skin was flushed, his hair was damp, and little glints of sunlight kept flickering in his eyes. It was the kind of image that made her rethink all those cautious promises she'd been making, and consider ripping off his clothes right then and there. But he'd taunted her. She decided to do something else instead. There was nothing schooled or strategic about the way she leapt upon him. Chances were, if he'd been a stranger, she would have done more harm to herself than good. As it stood, he had very little choice in the matter. When their legs tangled together, both flew straight off their feet. They landed with a thump on the ground, rolling with shrieks of laughter across the grass. She came out on top, but that was quick to change. In the blink of an eye, he overpowered and replaced her, pinning her wrists above her head as he leaned down with a breathless grin. "Bold move, sweetheart, except now I'm up here and you're down there." His fingers tightened and he leaned down further. "And what in the world are you going to do?" She gazed up at him, then bit his cheek. "Seven hells!" He reared back with a gasp of laughter, while a chorus of slow applause rang out in the clearing. The pair of them turned just as Eden walked out of the forest, with a string of fish hanging from each hand. He took one look at their compromised position, then flashed a wide grin. "That's an interesting tactic," he commented. "I've used it many times myself." Kiera pushed to her feet, laughing all the while, as Jesse leaned back on his heels, still rubbing at his cheek. His hair fell in tangles across his forehead as he regarded the Fae. "Sounds like you've been a good teacher." He tilted his head appraisingly. "Almost as good as me. But you know what they say, the better the warrior, the better the mentor." Eden smiled faintly, tossing the fish upon the stone. "I have heard it said differently," he mused. "Something like, 'Those who can't fight, teach.' I think I know where this is going." Jesse rubbed his chin, having yet to rise from the grass. "Only one way to know for sure. Otherwise the question would haunt us for endless years to come." His eyes flashed with mischief. "Careful around yourself." "There it is." "There would be no challenge," the Fae said calmly. "But I will beat you if you like." His mind drifted back to that moment in the forest. "I'm sure I can find the motivation." Kiera's pulse quickened, remembering the same thing. "Eden, you recently sprinted up the side of a monster," she chided. "You were almost burnt straight through. You need to rest that arm." He gave it a cursory swing, flashing a smile in return. "I'm healed." It certainly did look that way, but she couldn't help but worry that, as fun as this venture had started, it was bound to end in tears, or possibly a freshly dug grave to be saluted over fish. She ground her fists into her hips, the same way she'd seen stern women do in her village. "I absolutely forbid it." There was a pause. "That's adorable," Eden replied cheerfully, tossing his cloak beside the fire. "You've perfected the stance and everything. Just enough menace to give me the chills." Jesse nodded, raking back his hair. "It's giving me flashbacks of our pack mother. The woman once rapped me across the knuckles so hard it broke a bone in my hand." She glared at both, then plopped down beside the fire. "Fine, kill each other. What do I care?" Jesse chuckled to himself, checking discreetly to make sure the Fae wasn't carrying a blade, while Eden calmly removed his bow and tied back his hair. "No one's going to be killing anyone," he assured her calmly. "I'm going to teach the boy a lesson, that's all." She forgot her false anger and leaned forward suddenly, wondering if that was true. Her eyes lingered on the Fae before drifting across the clearing to where Jessie was bouncing slightly in place. "Don't tuck your thumbs," she advised. He threw her a strange look. "Yes, I know." Then the two crashed together, and Kiera leaned back in surprise. Yes, it's true." To his eternal credit, Jesse was agile and brave. He had a way of predicting things that defied his age, and a speed of reaction that could put warriors with 10 times more experience to shame. A young wolf in all his glory. It was almost tiring just to watch, feeling the surges and ebbs of adrenaline, catching your breath time and time again, while your heart pounded like a marathon in your chest. But after only a few drawn-out moments, the truth became abundantly clear. The men were not in the same league. Perhaps it was because, while Jesse may have fought with the skill of a man twice his age, the Fae was much, much older. Perhaps it was merely that one was a shifter and the other a Fae. For while Jesse was impressive, Eden was pure sunlight, catching every angle and filling every crack. There was nothing tiring about watching him. Kiera could have done it for hours. The graceful turns of his body, the deadly flash of a smile. It was exhilarating, like witnessing a young god come down to earth, amusing himself with the games of mortals. Not until much later would she realize this was because no part of her was perpetually tensed, wondering if he would fail. She knew that he wouldn't. A man gifted with such talent could only ever succeed. After only a few minutes, even an amateur like herself could spot the inequality. Only a few minutes after that, Jesse detached himself with a gasp and began taking off his clothes. Eden stepped back in surprise, then flashed her a knowing look. "Option 2, he mouthed. She did everything in her power not to giggle, sensing that Jesse's pride couldn't take another blow. The air shimmered, and before he had time to wonder about the shifter's complete lack of modesty, the man himself was gone, and a lean wolf had sprung up in his place. The Fae nodded to himself, murmuring without a hint of sarcasm, "Good. You should have done that from the start." This time the fight was different. Still not exactly equal, but different. It was a strange thing to see a man fighting a wolf, even if that wolf was technically a human, even if that man wasn't technically human himself. At any moment, Kiera expected things to break into their usual pattern, to fall in a level of predictability that could be measured and followed along. Except that never happened, because there was nothing predictable about such a match. The tight circles that grounded such games were constantly and jarringly broken, as man lunged at beast, and beast threw himself back upon man. Eden would spin low and attempt to sweep out the shifter's legs, only to feel a pair of teeth sink into his back. Jesse would throw his entire weight upon the Fae, attempting to off-balance him, only to discover that the Fae was no longer there, at which point he'd usually receive a punishing kick in the ribs. There were many times when things moved so quickly that the scene itself blurred before her eyes, as if the rest of the landscape was static, but there was an odd smear of colour at its core. It would only ever last a second, then the shapes would spiral back into themselves, usually punctuated with a burst of laughter or an enthusiastic howl. Things would pause, then the fight continued anew. After a few minutes of playful quarrel, both opponents drew back with a look of frustration, both in the power that was levelled against them and the skills they found themselves unable to use. As Eden would tell her later, it was nearly impossible to fight a wolf without killing it. They didn't succumb to the shocks and pains of regular collisions the way other creatures might. They rallied too quickly, and when pitted against one head-on, a wolf's strength would nearly always win. The only way to beat one was to use lethal force, quick and decisive action. Of course, this was something circumstances would never allow him to do. In the same way, Jesse was depriving himself all his greatest weapons. Instead of using claws, he battered at the Fae with soft paws. Instead of using any force into bites, lest he break the skin, he was checking himself and holding back at every opportunity, drawing the fight along. That being said, the Fae found an eventual compromise. "That's enough!" In an astonishing burst of speed, he grabbed the wolf by the back of the neck and literally threw it into the ground where they were standing. There was a muffled cry, one that sounded very much like a human oath, but before the shifter could leap to his feet, the Fae was kneeling on him. "Stay down," he commanded, half laughing at the same time. "There is no end to this, and my arm is not yet as healed as I thought. Stay down, Jesse," he repeated, when the wolf tried once more to rise. "You have lost." But those words never sat well with the shifter. With a look of the utmost obedience, he stopped his struggles and rolled slightly, so the two were face to face. Eden looked down warily, his knees still lodged beneath the creature's chin. But when Jesse made no further attempt to move, he relaxed his position with a smile. "See? That wasn't so hard." A wet tongue slid up the side of his face. "Margaret!" the Fae cursed, kicking him down again. There was a burst of canine laughter, and he wiped his cheek with true murder in his eyes. "Now I kill you." The two collided with fresh vengeance, the sharp cries and keening yips echoing out of the clearing and into the dense forests below. They circled each other like devils, every focus on attack. Perhaps that's why no one heard him coming.
"I thought this might be a bloodbath. I see now that you are friends."
The two ripped away from each other as an old man stepped into the clearing. At least, he might have been an old man. It was difficult to say, in the same way the Fae was hard to interpret. There were lines on his face, but they only gave character. There was grey in his hair, but it appeared only faded by the sun. Certain parts of him moved slowly, while others were quick, giving him a sharp, almost startling demeanour, one that was tempered by a carefully constructed smile. Kiera pushed slowly to her feet, wary of the tension in the others.
"An odd consortium,"
he murmured, although no one yet had spoken.
"But then these are odd times which we find ourselves living in. I apologize for startling you. I was drawn only by the fire."
Not until later would that strike her as a very odd thing to say. What else might have drawn him? "You did not startle us," Eden replied fiercely. "You interrupted. But you may feel free at any time to correct your mistake." The others flashed him a look, utterly stunned. Despite being known for fiery tempers, the Fae were also polite to a fault. It took a lot to rattle them, a lot more to get under their skin, a lot more than anything this man had done. Then perhaps he knows something we don't. Instead of taking offense, the man countered with a smile.
"A child of the stars. True to your name. I haven't seen one of your kind in years."
The Fae was unyielding and cold.
"I would imagine you avoid us,"
he replied evenly. The man took a step closer, but Eden held up a hand, staring him down the way one might regard a venomous snake. "That is close enough." The man froze where he stood, and Kiera started inching nearer to the others. She had been travelling long enough to have adopted their moods as her own. If the Fae viewed this stranger as a potential threat, she would do the same. In any case, he filled her with a sense of nameless dread.
"Peace, friend. I mean you no harm."
Eden smiled sweetly, hand drifting to his blade. "Yet still you linger all the same." Finding no ingress with one person, he turned to another.
"That is a fine wolf you have."
Jesse visibly stiffened beneath his attention. The dark chocolate hair on his back bristled into a hard line. By the very nature of his transformation, the sight alone should have been terrifying. but somehow it had the exact opposite effect. Perhaps it was because instead of snarling, as was his instinct, he found himself inexplicably cringing against the Fae's side. Eden lowered her hand without looking, giving a habitual pat. "He isn't mine," he replied curtly. "He belongs to himself." The man tilted his head, regarding the wolf with a pensive smile. "Beautiful." At that point, odds were high that Jesse wanted to shift back immediately, but he didn't want the stranger ogling his naked body with that unnerving stare. Fortunately, the Fae's patience had reached its limit. "Where are you headed, sorcerer?" he demanded. "What is your business in these parts?" Kiera gasped in surprise, feeling like a fog had lifted. "He is a sorcerer." The man tore his eyes from the others with a hint of frustration. "And if the answer isn't pleasing to you, what is your business?" There was a dangerous pause. "I'm heading to a village not far past Pinard. I have family there." His voice went dry at the Fae's expression. "Yes, even we sorcerers have kin. We do not all simply spring from the heavens." A shiver ran up Kiera's spine. "Begone then, and pray I do not hear of more trouble." Eden placed a hand upon his dagger, making himself clear. "I have seen your face now. I will remember it." The man stood for a second longer, and Kiera got the terrible feeling he was remembering their faces the same way. Then he turned without another word and vanished quick as he'd come. The others waited until they could no longer hear his steps, then turned to the Fae. "Why did you speak to him like that?" Kiera demanded, feeling secretly grateful at the same time. "He was an old man seeking the warmth of a fire. He'd done nothing wrong." Jesse shifted back and reached for his clothes, looking uncharacteristically pale. "He was not an old man," Eden replied calmly. "He was quite young, and perhaps he hadn't yet done anything. Not to us. But better he continue with a warning in the back of his mind." With that, he forgot about sorcerers and sparring, and began roasting the fish he'd caught over the open fire. The others shared a glance, but seemed in no rush to fill the silence. It wasn't until a few minutes had passed that the inevitable question burst from Kiera's lips. "You said he hadn't done anything. Not to us." She paused involuntarily, staring at the Fae with a hint of dread. "Do you believe he's done something terrible to others?" Eden rotated the stick, never taking his eyes from the flames. "He's a sorcerer, Kiera. He's been doing terrible things his entire life." Chapter 13. Needless to say, the friends finished their meal quickly and continued hiking through the forest, determined to put some distance between themselves and any voyeuristic magicians who might mean them harm. They travelled with the sun, and, by the time it began to set, they found themselves far away from where they'd originally started, in a wooded bluff above a wide valley. Kiera stared over the edge as the fire danced and swayed behind her, wondering if there were people living inside. It seemed too big and too naturally protected for someone not to have taken advantage. Such places were rare, and most had been settled years before she was alive. "I'll take the first watch, if you two want to clean up the meal." Jesse started taking off his cloak before either of the others could answer. Since their run-in with the sorcerer, he'd been itching to get out of his skin. "Perhaps it's best tonight to run the perimeter." "In case we're caught unawares?" Based upon nothing but a mortal pride, she expected the Fae to chafe against the notion on principle, but he merely nodded along, lifting the cauldron from the fire to clean. "Yes, I would keep moving," he murmured, but he glanced up at the last moment and added a sudden, "If you run into trouble, use that signature move of yours. Just lick it up the face." The last thing they saw before Jesse shifted was the flash of a smile. "That was nicely done." She twisted her fingers in the edges of her cloak, wrapping it tighter around her body as the wolf vanished and she watched the Fae moving around the fire. Those dancing flames had swiftly been reduced to embers, and he was using those to boil the water with which to clean. It was casual and pragmatic. It was something she had surely done 1,000 times herself. Yet for some reason, it struck her as utterly ridiculous. By the very nature of what the Fae were, she couldn't imagine his people doing mundane things. Raising children, fetching water. They seemed in her mind to exist only to shoot arrows, slay monsters, and gaze up at the stars. He had never seemed more believable than a few days before, when he was tearing the life from some hellish creature, or just a ways after that, when he was alone in a haloed forest, head bowed as if in prayer, gazing at a tiny miracle springing to life in his palms. That was a Fae. That was their business. Watching Eden scrub out the pot they'd used to make stew, she felt a sudden compulsion to rip it from his eternal hands.
"What is it?" he asked without looking up. "You're looking at me strangely."
Too embarrassed to answer, she merely shrugged and left him to draw his own conclusions. But those seemed to be strangely pragmatic as well. The cauldron lowered a few inches, and he stared above the blackened rim, making a quick study of her face.
"I knew it was folly to allow the wolf to cook," he muttered, shaking his head. "Are you feeling ill? I can find you some mint."
"Sometimes you don't seem like a real person." He drew back, so caught with surprise that for a moment he lost the sense to speak. 12 expressions flitted half-formed across his face before those bright eyes locked onto hers.
"I am a real person, as real as you or Jessie."
He spoke slowly, almost cautiously. Never for a second did those eyes leave her face.
"Why would you say something like that?"
She tried to shrug it off, but things had strayed far from casual. The pot had been forgotten, left to sit upon the coals, while the silence hung between them like a burst of rain about to drop. "There are times when you seem almost like one of us," she admitted quietly, unable to meet his gaze. "You appear the same age, though I know you aren't. You laugh and sing and dream and do all the things a mortal might do." She paused. "And then there are moments like earlier today." Her voice trailed off as her mind drifted back, not to the sorcerer or the Blesserin, not even to the little dryad cupped in his hand. It struck upon a random moment, when he'd been walking beside them in the forest. The sun had caught his face just so, his lips had curved with a smile. "I have never seen anything like it." He couldn't have known exactly what she was thinking, even if she'd wanted to explain. The words stuck in her throat, but he seemed to guess the general sentiment. A blush stole over his own cheeks as he struggled to move them past it.
"To laugh and sing and dream,"
he repeated in a murmur, trying to catch her gaze with a teasing smile.
"You think these belong to mortals alone? Can we not have our share?"
"Don't make a joke. I am being honest with you." That sobered him quickly, but left him with nothing to say. "I don't mean to embarrass you," she added quickly, lowering her eyes with a flush. "I know you don't like to speak of such things. There just seems such a great distance between us. Sometimes it feels like I could never cross it, like I'm not even meant to try." That quiet fell again between them, only this time Eden was watching. No matter what rise and fall of emotions was cresting his eyes, it seemed he could not turn them away. When at last he spoke, his voice seemed louder than before.
"And what is the reason for distance, if not to be crossed? Do you think there are parts of you of which I'm not jealous? Your impermanence, your transience, the added significance to each passing thought. There are times when it seems—"
He trailed off with a sigh.
"There are times when it seems to scarcely matter if my people carry on from one day to the next. When time is unmarked, it ceases to have any meaning. The days, the years, the seasons, they all blend together."
She shook her head questioningly. "You were gifted an eternity, yet you make it sound like a burden."
"Ah, but that is the trouble with eternity."
His lips quirked in a cheerless smile.
"When you've lived so many years, you cease to feel blessed. If one is not careful, they cease to feel anything at all."
Strange as the conversation had turned, she had come to know Eden, as well as he would allow himself to be known, and it was easy to see how much a thing would be a death to him. The most ironic death the fates could spin, one where the person never actually died.
"Perhaps, at times, we overcorrect," he mused. "Try to live only in the moment. I've known others that lean the opposite direction, keeping a broad perspective. It is easier, perhaps, but such a notion has always frightened me. To intentionally create such a barrier can only trap one inside."
She stared back in quiet amazement, not at the scope of things they were discussing, not that they'd finally broached such an irresistible topic, but of the vulnerability in him when he spoke of such things, amazed that the most fearless man she'd ever met would admit to feeling scared. "You are not like that," she said suddenly, thinking of his cold brethren in Farian. From the moment they'd met, the Fae had been nothing but open and warm. He cast her a faint smile.
"Sometimes I am."
They lapsed into silence. "Is that why you came with me?" she asked plainly. They had danced around the question many times before. "You confessed not to have believed my story, and yet you came along." His lips parted with a long breath, as if he'd often wondered the same thing himself. Though when he finally answered, it seemed almost anticlimactic, said with a shrug and a smile. "I told you, sometimes we dare to hope." The friends roused themselves early the next morning and began walking without any particular discussion or plan. When Kiera built the courage to ask about the route, she was always given the same reply. "We're heading north." It was a tangle of pathways that crossed the woods, some of them real, made by rangers, some flattened by animals, and some designed to lead travelers astray. On 2 separate occasions, Kiera had to be caught quickly by one of the others, as the trail beneath her feet gave way. The rains had been strong in those parts, just as they'd been in her own village, and it got to the point where, though the sun was shining, it was hard to trust one's own feet. But that's not the worst of it. The sorcerer had rattled each of the friends more than they were willing to say. Even the Fae, who dealt with such people before, found himself jumping at shadows and startling every time a squirrel ran up a tree. The 4th time this happened, Jessie let out an irritated sigh. "I still don't understand what happened with the sorcerer. Why did you not just kill him?" Eden raised his eyebrows.
"Kill him?"
The shifter threw him a hard look. "You've killed a lot of people, Eden, don't be shy." He hacked through a particularly thick cluster of brambles, yanking out his blade after each swing. "And I'm not just talking about a single man. The entire lot should have been wiped out years ago. Why was such a thing never done?" The Fae didn't answer immediately. Perhaps he was deliberately slowing the pace of the conversation. Perhaps he was simply considering what to say in reply. "An entire group of people," he replied softly. "That's dangerous talk. And by what authority would I make such a decision? The man was a danger to my friends, so I ran him off. There is nothing more to it than that. I can claim no special privileges just because I don't like the man." "But if he was a danger to us, he may be a danger to others," Kiera inserted hesitantly, giving the Fae an apologetic glance. "You said it yourself. He is a sorcerer. He's been doing terrible things since he was born. If he is bound to do those things again, why did you not stop him?" Eden glanced over in surprise, perhaps with a touch of disappointment.
"I'm hearing this from you?"
She flushed and looked away, but the shifter wouldn't let it drop. Why did you not stop him? He insisted. You threatened to do as much before he left the campsite. Half the time you were speaking to him, the hand was on your blade. By what authority would I do so? Eden repeated with a hint of frustration. By the Fae's authority, Jesse answered bluntly. Come on, you cannot play kings one moment, then leave us mortals to either flourish or perish the next. There was a pause. You remembered that rather precisely. The shifter's eyes flashed. Yes, I did. Eden sighed, conceding the point. The Fae don't have kings and queens. They have houses, he added suddenly, continuing their trek up the mountains. Bloodlines, really. Some are older and more powerful than others. You descend from one of these houses? Kiera said with sudden certainty, never doubting for a moment that it was true. His eyes were touched with sadness as he gazed into the distant sky. It seems such a silly thing, does it not? He answered softly. Creating division where none existed before. A child's folly, drawing lines in the sand. They spoke on the matter no further. Jesse was still seething, boiling hotter the more he looped arguments in his head, but the Fae was putting up no resistance, and worse than that, he seemed genuinely troubled. Since he'd said those final words, a kind of melancholy had come over him. He walked without speaking, without looking at anything around him. Only, every so often, he'd lift his eyes with an inaudible sigh. The sight of it was enough to hold even the shifter's tongue. They walked together in relative silence for the next 2 hours, winding along the slow curve of that picturesque valley, making excellent time, for they had set out so early in the day. It wasn't until they'd reached the northern side of the bluff that all three of them stopped in their tracks. What is that? Even Kiera could hear it, which was rare, because she had no special talents to allow her to do so. A discordant symphony of noises, albeit a cheerful one, floating up on the breeze. They ventured a bit further, peering down into the valley, but their view was blocked by the ring of stretching yew trees that lined the valley's edge. But it must have been quite loud indeed for the sound to have carried such a distance. A large group, perhaps, or men doing wicked things. Stay here, Eden said softly, slipping away into the green. He hadn't made it 3 steps before Jesse's hand flashed out and caught his shoulder. We should avoid the valley, or we should all go down together. He spoke with a protective edge that hadn't been there before the Blistering. It's too dangerous to go alone, even for you. The Fae glanced at the hand, then slowly pulled his arm free. A faint grin tugged at the corner of his lips, but his eyes were nothing but serious as he lifted both hands into the air. Stay. It was such a strange gesture, spoken in such a stilted affection, that both Jesse and Kiera did in fact freeze where they were standing, heads tilted as if he'd gone a bit mad. Eden waited a moment, then backed away with a smile. Good dog. Jesse made a furious swipe for him, but the Fae was already gone, melting into the greenery with such shocking ease, it was as though he'd vanished into thin air. You know what? The Fae should take control of the realm, officially. He shook his head, glaring into the trees. Just to give the rest of us someone to overthrow. Kiera snorted, settling down beneath the yew. I'm serious, the shifter insisted. It could end violently, in great pools of immortal blood. There's a selling point. She cast him an upwards glance. You two have a very strange friendship. Without another word, the two settled down and began to wait, twisting their fingers and plucking the grass, both pretending they weren't as nervous as they actually felt. At one point, Jesse stood abruptly and paced towards the spot where the Fae had disappeared, tilting his head and closing his eyes in concentration, listening for the inevitable scream. Meditating, are we? Hells! The shifter jumped a mile as Eden appeared behind him, clapping his shoulders and taking great satisfaction in the way he'd jumped.
"You often have that effect on people," he said safely, "and after having travelled with you a little, I think some of those calming strategies could have great effect." The air shimmered threateningly around them, but Kiera swept calmly in between. "So what is it?" she asked. It couldn't have been anything terrible, otherwise the Fae wouldn't be so playful. It couldn't have been anything urgent, otherwise he wouldn't be taking his time. His eyes twinkled as he tilted his head towards the valley. "You're going to love this." The Festival of Carnassus. Apparently, it was long awaited and much loved throughout the realm. 7 days of feast to gather together and thank the gods for a bountiful harvest. Apparently, it had become an annual celebration, as people of all sorts would travel for weeks just to attend. Eden had lost track of things and forgotten they were nearing the date, otherwise he might have been attending himself. Kiera had never heard of such a thing. News like that seldom reached the ears of her distant village. But the Fae was right. She had never seen anything that delighted her more. It was easy to see how echoes of such merriment had floated all the way into the forest. There must have been hundreds of creatures touched with all brands of magic, drinking and dancing and feasting alike. Long tables had been stretched across one side of the meadow, while a row of cedar booths, same as they'd seen in the village market, curved in a line around all the rest. The space in the middle had been reserved for sport, but the quicker the barrels of mead ran empty, the quicker the structure began to loosen, and each of the areas began blending into the next. The creatures themselves were a blending she had never seen. A lone goblin was sleeping beneath a stack of picnic blankets. Covens of witches stood beside steaming cauldrons, hawking potions for cleverness and hexes for scorned lovers, whilst drinking quite heavily on the side. Whenever the pot would drain empty, one of them would discreetly tip in some whiskey until it was back up to the brim. If anyone happened to see them do it, they'd flash a winning smile and offer a bargain. 2 life-changing revelations for the price of 1. A pair of warlocks was flouting their luck not far beyond, sitting with crossed legs and palms lifted together, trying to manifest a few sparks. Nymphs drifted like wisps of clouds amongst them, their slender feet barely imprinting the meadow grass. Their dark eyes sparkled beneath blossoms of sweet wisteria and pale lilac, wreathed like crowns atop tumbles of shimmering hair. Horn-toothed dwarves plodded together in packs, and whisper-thin nixies twinkled brightly above them, blinking in and out of focus in spheres of blinding light. Only rarely did Kiera see what she might deem to be actual people. Everyone was touched with something a little special and a little different from the rest. The games were just as interesting. There were targets set up for archers, the grass beside them littered with drunken attempts. A pack of wolves was wrestling playfully nearby. Every now and then, one would break free and dash recklessly into the line of fire, leaping high despite the calls of protests to catch one of the arrows in their teeth. There were feats of strength beside the tables. Barrel-chested men were heaving giant rocks as far as they could manage, laughing and toiling and grunting with strain as their friends placed bets and called encouragement from behind frothing cups of ale. Kiera's lips curved in a slight smile at their boasting, thinking of how easy such a thing would be for either of her companions. Jesse would most likely refuse, deciding such trivial acts would demean him. Eden would most likely do it, then declare himself a cheerful god. Speak of the devil? Jesse lowered his chin to her shoulder, watching as well. Would you like to take some of those stones with us? He asked innocently. There is room next to your novels in my pack. She smacked him without looking, biting her lip with a grin. You owe your life to my novels. Have a little respect. Eden draped his arms around both of them, steering them away from the spectacle to where the crowd had grown thickest around the tables. Come, let us get some food. She followed along beside him, holding tight to Jesse's hand. Despite the fact that she was travelling with a shifter and a fae, she had never seen such cheerful chaos, and there was a genuine worry that if she didn't find a way to anchor herself,
she might actually get lost. Each direction she looked added another layer of overstimulation. A smattering of bright-faced women soared away on fiddles, stepped lightly through the crowd, while a pack of children followed behind, striking tambourines and singing, their fingers strung with tiny copper bells. The men stuck like toads to their tables, lifting gruff voices with every new verse, but mostly calling out that universal chorus she'd come to know so well. "More ale!" Her body tensed involuntarily, then she relaxed with a secret smile, realizing all at once that just as her friends were studying the crowd, some people in the crowd had noticed them as well. She watched as a lovely maiden tossed back her hair, trying to catch Eden's attention. Just a few steps behind her, a young man with glowing hazel eyes was trying to do the same. He smiled at both of them, never breaking his stride. "So what of Carnassus?" she asked curiously. "How did the festival acquire its name?" The men pointed in unison to a portly man sitting at the end of one of the tables. "That's Carnassus." She stared with a touch of surprise. If they'd told her it was named for a place, she would have just as easily believed it. This loaf of a man looked just the same as any other, stretching the waistband of his trousers. "Who is he?" Jessie shrugged. "Some rich man who decided to throw himself a festival." He caught her blank look and laughed. "There is truly nothing more to it than that." Eden guided them ever forward. "Just keep walking," he instructed. "When I said we should find some food, what I really meant is that we should find some whiskey. There's usually a good showing at this sort of thing." The shifter perked up immediately, but Kiera was in her own world, letting herself be towed along by the wrist as her gaze drifted blissfully through the crowd. It was like something of a dream, something that would stretch along forever, and surely not be done in just 7 days' time. Even more endearing than the roving wanderers, the packs and clusters bound together by race were the families, held stronger still in ties of blood. It shouldn't have been a shock to them, yet it was. Parents tending to their children, children ignoring their parents and racing after each other with shrieks of laughter beneath the light of the sun. Only then did it strike her there was nothing so frivolous about such merriment as she had thought before. The gathering of so many creatures, the connections they made, were of far greater importance than anything being sold at the booths. They were building something here, something that would linger even after they had left the meadow behind, something that would keep propelling them forward, just like the dream she'd imagined, lasting a great deal longer than a mere 7 days' time. Her gaze swept over the scene like a painter's brush, and she vowed to herself she would never forget a single face. It was only then she realized that she was not the only one watching. A pair of faded eyes was staring back just the same. "There you are!" A raspy voice cut above the noise, drifting from the lips of a woman who was older than time. She stood so close to the post of her booth that she may well have been part of the structure itself, like some rogue carving had grown bored with watching and taken a mind of its own. The men glanced over their shoulders as Kiera drifted closer. "Such lovely locks," the woman croaked, eyeing the girl's crimson hair with a lopsided expression that might have been a smile. "I have been waiting for you." Kiera felt the others come up behind her, but she didn't turn away. Truth be told, she wasn't sure she could. The sight of such defiant age stilled her heart, and she'd been asked to come closer. Then the woman's head jerked suddenly, and she continued in a voice unlike her own. "When the drifting moon wanes and the hour is nigh, 6 horsemen will—" "Ignore that." Eden grabbed both friends by the backs of their collars and steered them away quickly, leaving the old woman standing alone beside the booth, clawed fingers still gesticulating in the air. Kiera glanced up in shock, but Eden merely rolled his eyes. "No good ever comes from a prophecy." They wandered a bit further before finding a place at the end of one of the long tables. A cheerful-looking girl dropped off a trio of flagons, and before they knew it, the horrors of their journey were forgotten, and they were drinking and feasting along with all the rest. Ale had a way of doing that, when drunk in thick-handled mugs. Kiera had seen such a thing all her life, but she had never quite understood until now. "We should make toasts," she whispered, thrilled with the novelty. "That's what people usually do. They make toasts." It was unlikely that the others would have heard her. Had they been actual people, there was a decent chance they wouldn't. But both glanced down with matching smiles, lifting their flagons into the air. The Fae spoke first. He did not know how to speak a second. "To water serpents and dragons," he cried. "To glycerin and landslides. To empty flasks and burnt food, and to new-found friends who are sure to be strangled by mine own hand." Jessie flashed a grin. "To girls who like books, and to the boys who carry them." There was a messy clink, and they drank deeply. Two of them drank deeply. The other decided she didn't like ale. "Shall we stay here for the night?" Jessie asked lazily, stretching back with contentment in his chair, the same as she. "Are people even allowed to stay? Or is it, 'We can stay for the feast'?" Eden interrupted, "but we should not linger." His eyes drifted over the crowd as well, still sharp despite how much he'd been drinking. "You forget, Shifter. There are people we mean to avoid. This is a popular festival. I don't want us running into them here." A tremor ran through Jesse's body, momentarily rendering him still. "They would never come so far east," he answered, though his eyes swept over the meadow just the same. "Not until I left the pack did I hear of this festival myself." A meagre comfort, but he said no more about staying over. "Well, I want to go exploring," Kiera announced, setting down her fork and pushing up from the table. If she was being practical, she would rest and eat like the others, gathering strength for what was about to come. But there was nothing practical about such a place, and she didn't want to waste a single moment. "Fear not, I promise not to add to our library." To her great surprise, the Fae leaned forward and handed her a pair of coins. "Be sure to get yourself something," he winked, perhaps remembering that quiet gratitude when she'd confessed to never owning a book. "If only a pleasing memory to be made." Jesse stretched his arms casually across his chair, speaking into his drink. "You could always get that mace. Gift it to a friend." He felt the others watching and gave an innocent shrug. "They say the greatest happiness is a happiness shared." Kiera nodded slowly, backing away. "Yet Eden has no desire for a mace. He fights with other weapons." "I wasn't talking about—" Jessie trailed away with a sigh. "Never mind. Just be careful, would you? Men and ale rarely make peaceful friends. But you know that." She pursed her lips. "I most certainly do." "Don't wander off with anything that has teeth stronger than your hand," Eden added calmly, as if it was standard advice. He threw the shifter a sudden look. "That includes Jessie." She left before she could hear the ensuing argument, yet another thing that would surely not be helped by the presence of ale. The air was warm, the sun was determined to linger, and ahead of her stretched endless possibilities, though she had a specific destination in mind. It wasn't hard to find her way back to the old woman's tent. It was one of the few that had been anchored without pegs, and was rippling precariously in the breeze. Those ringing words had lodged something deep in her brain, and although the Fae had dismissed it as nothing more than childish nonsense, she couldn't help but wonder how the woman was going to finish the phrase. Something about horsemen, about the hour drawing nigh. She cleared the last of the tables, leaving the reach of her friend's watchful eyes. But the tent itself was sitting the same as before. The woman herself was missing. "She's gone," a thickly accented voice called from an adjacent booth. "Back to the wagons for a nap. It's still early, but she's quite old." There was a knowing pause. "If she said anything to unsettle you, Rest assured, she also spent a great part of the morning on her pipe."
Kiera smiled with a blush, feeling silly for having returned. Perhaps she should get that mace after all, just so the others wouldn't suspect. Yet some strange compulsion bid her to stay.
"Are you from around these parts? You don't look it."
A young woman stepped out from behind the counter, bustling with her hands. A witch, by the looks of things. She was already packing up a drawstring bag, most likely on her way to the feast, but she knew an easy customer when she saw one, and she paused when Kiera drew close.
"I saw you come this way before. Care for a glimpse of your future?"
Kiera hovered uncertainly, guiltily rolling the coins between her fingers. What would her friends say? Would this fall under the category of a pleasing memory? Then she pulled in a breath and made up her mind.
"Yes, all right."
The woman flashed a bright smile, gesturing for her to sit in one of the chairs. In a flash, the brusque demeanor had vanished, replaced with something a bit woozier and harder to define. For a moment, the two merely sat there, waiting. Then a question broke the silence.
"Have you payment?"
Kiera blanked, then reached quickly into her pocket, forking over a coin.
"Yes, of course. Sorry, I've never done something like this before."
The woman rewarded her with a warm smile, slipping the silver into her tunic.
"That's all right."
She shook out her hands, folding them lightly upon the table.
"I actually prefer it. You know, most people write this off to be mere parlor tricks, but there is an art to it. A person can find answers if they are willing to listen."
In the days to come, Kiera would think upon those words quite often. A cloud of incense swept down from nowhere, engulfing them both. She let out a gasping cough and craned her neck, searching for cleaner air, but she was the only one who seemed to notice. The witch's body was still, then sudden, as if she was listening very hard for something, only to be buffeted occasionally by some invisible breeze. Then, at last, her lips curved into a smile.
"You are on a long journey," she murmured.
Perhaps it was how the conversation started, or perhaps it was because she was still speaking in the same voice she'd used before, but Kiera leaned suddenly closer, arms tingling with a shiver.
"Yes, I am. It's the farthest I've ever been from home."
The witch nodded slowly, never opening her eyes.
"But your home, that path is no longer open to you."
She tilted her head to the side, like she was trying to interpret the words herself.
"Your life of late has been full of questions, so many questions, and there is no end to them in sight." "Yes, I was hoping you could help with that."
The witch adjusted her position, leaning closer to her charge.
"Was there one of these questions you wanted answered in particular?"
Kiera's eyes flickered back towards Jessie, but she could never be so direct. Instead, she couched that question in another, one that could shed light upon a great many things.
"Where will I be in 5 years' time?"
The witch smiled, still rocking back and forth.
"Ah, clever girl. I have received many questions before. People want to know if they will be rich or they will be married, if the farm will be standing, or if they'll be able to conceive a child."
She paused ever so slightly.
"But I sense your purpose is different from these."
The rocking stopped, and she reached for Kiera's hands.
"Open yourself to me,"
she commanded. Kiera froze perfectly still, unable to know whether she was doing that or not. Her arm was rigid beneath those coiled fingers, as if they gripped her with 10 times the strength, but there was nothing certain about the witch's expression. If anything, she looked a bit surprised. Her eyes fluttered open, taking a second to focus.
"You will return to this very spot in just 5 years' time?"
Kiera pulled back with a start.
"You mean to the festival?" "The festival changes locations every year," the witch replied. "I mean exactly that I said, that after 5 years have passed, you will be in this very same place."
Without a second's pause, she pushed to her feet, blowing out the candle and packing up the booth as she'd been doing before. Kiera sat in a daze, feeling like the chair had claimed her. "I don't understand," she finally managed. "You mean literally? That I'll be standing in this same meadow? Or is this figuratively speaking, like I'll be asking the same questions?" The woman held out her hand for another coin.
"You want that answer? It's going to cost you."
Kiera's fingers wrapped hard around the silver before she abruptly pushed to her feet and walked away. She'd liked to have believed it was because she didn't trust the witch's practice. She may have lost half her spending money on a whimsical indulgence, but she refused to part with the other as part of a scam. But the quicker she walked, the faster the truth seemed to follow, dogging her every step like a pest that refused to be driven away. Some questions you never want answered. Despite the cheerful mayhem around her, she found her way back to her friends with relative ease, realizing too late that she should have found a false token to have appeased them. "Let's see it then," Jessie demanded. "What did you end up?" He trailed off, then stood suddenly to join her. "You went back to the fortune tellers, didn't you?" He leaned forward with a laugh, sniffing her hair. "Smell this," he said to the Fae. "It's like she fell into a vat of sandalwood and myrrh." Eden's eyes twinkled with a smile. "Did you uncover any great secrets, dear one? Did you ask about the dragon? Or is there something more personal you'd like to share?"
"I should have hitched a ride in one of the wagons." "I wouldn't like to share anything, thank you very much." She plopped down between them, facing the opposite direction in an attempt to avoid their gaze. "And if you must know, I didn't go back to the fortune tellers. I fell into a vat of incense, just like Jessie said." It may have been impossible to lie to a Fae, but that skill was hardly required. Her cheek flamed the second she said the words, and she continued not to look at anyone. Eden laughed softly, while the shifter flashed a wicked smile. "I never said it was incense." She poured herself another flagon of ale, gulping it down no matter the taste. The sun was still climbing to the peak of the sky, and there would be no doubt even greater festivities to distract her as the day's merriments wound to a close. Just on the walk back to the tables, she'd heard talk of fire-breathers and chariot racing. 2 youths had been arguing about the possibility of seeing a unicorn. One claimed that he'd glimpsed it already, while the other swore it wasn't real. The witch's quiet words faded into echoes, slipping to a less worried place in her mind. So what if she was still asking questions in 5 years? So what if she returned to that very meadow? In all her life, she had never seen a place so beautiful. A sunlit oasis nestled amongst the trees. She leaned back with a contented sigh, feeling as if some part of her never wanted to leave. But of course, that is the nature of all good things. One never feels them so sweetly as the moment before they are ripped away. It started as a feeling more than anything else, a slight change in the air, as though the sun had been shaded by a passing cloud. She was not the only one to have noticed. That was the first thing that truly cued her in. In what felt like the space of a single heartbeat, more than 100 creatures scattered about the meadow simultaneously lifted their gaze. They were the ones touched with magic, the ones who sensed things above the rest. Like animals sense the approach of a fire, they stopped what they were doing and turned their gaze to the forest, staring with the same look of blank curiosity as they tried to place what it was. The others took cues from them, turning to face the same direction, though they could find nothing. Later, that part would strike Kiera with a dark kind of humour. How could we not have seen it coming? For a suspended moment, the world hung in sudden silence, broken only by the plaintive cry of a bird drifting on the breeze. Then the branches ripped and the earth trembled, and a horde of monsters burst from the trees.
This has been Curiosity, written by W.J. May, narrated by Zach Smith.